It happened without warning, the way most important things seem to. Not with an explosion, not with the tearing of skies, but with a sigh, soft and unremarkable, like the sound of a candle giving up its flame. One moment, Rick's portal gun hummed with the green spark of infinite doors. The next, it was quiet. A little silence settled into the house that night, and though no one said anything at first, everyone felt it. Rick turned the device in his hand again and again, as if the silence were a trick that could be undone by stubbornness. But it did not return to life. Its weight felt heavier than usual, almost like holding an old stone, a relic from a time already gone. Morty watched his grandfather closely, not with fear, but with that restless curiosity children have when they sense that something larger is happening, something they will understand only years later. That evening, Morty sat at the kitchen table, tracing circles in the condensation on his water glass, waiting for Rick to say something. But Rick didn't. He only stared out the window where the stars glittered like broken glass scattered across the night. Beth busied herself with small chores, clinking dishes that didn't need washing. Jerry mumbled about batteries and warranties, but no one really listened. And Summer scrolled endlessly on her phone, pretending she wasn't paying attention, though her eyes kept flicking toward the garage door. The silence of the gun stretched into the silence of the family, and for the first time in a long while, there was no great noise of adventure waiting to scoop Morty away. There was only the sound of the refrigerator buzzing, the soft bark of a dog outside, and the faint rattle of wind against the windows. Ordinary sounds, almost holy in their persistence. Morty thought of all the places that green glow had taken him, worlds of crystal trees, cities where the sky itself spoke, caverns that smelled like old rain. He remembered the fear and the wonder, the way every adventure felt endless while it was happening. And he remembered something else too. How, when it was over, he always ended up right back here at this table with a sandwich or a bowl of cereal, his grandfather somewhere nearby, pretending to be uninterested in whether Morty survived. Now there would be no next doorway, no sudden escape, only this house, this night, this family. Morty felt something between relief and sorrow, like breathing out after holding your breath for too long. Rick finally set the gun down on the table. The sound of it touching the wood was sharper than expected, like a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter. His eyes, usually full of calculation and half-mad lightning, were softer now. Tired, maybe, or simply older. "Guess that's it," he muttered, though no one asked what he meant. For Morty, the words carried more weight than he could bear. He wanted to ask questions. Why now? Can't you fix it? Where will we go? But the questions stayed in his chest. Instead, he only nodded, as if agreeing to something much larger than himself. Later that night, Morty lay in his bed, staring at the faint glow of his ceiling stars. They were stickers from years ago, faded and peeling, but still clinging stubbornly to the plaster. He thought about real stars far away, and how many of them he had seen through portals, burning suns of purple, or stars shaped like spirals, or ones that hummed softly, like tuning forks. And he thought about how small his room was, how still. Yet the stillness wasn't empty. It was filled with memory. He listened to the house breathing, floorboards settling, the hum of the garage light Rick had forgotten to switch off, Summer's muffled laughter through the wall. He thought about his grandfather, sitting alone with the silent portal gun, staring into a silence that was probably louder than Morty could imagine. There was a kind of mystery in it, he realized. A portal that closed was not just an ending. It was an invitation to see what remained when doors stopped opening. To notice What had been overlooked in all the running and falling and near escapes? Maybe the silence wasn't a failure. Maybe it was a gift. The thought made his eyelids heavy. Dreams tugged at him like gentle waves pulling at a boat's rope. He imagined the stars outside tilting slowly, like someone turning down a lamp. He imagined Rick, not as the reckless genius always sprinting toward the next catastrophe, but as a tired man who had finally set something down. He imagined a world where the quiet was the adventure. And before sleep claimed him, Morty whispered to himself, almost as if promising, "I'll remember this night. Even if nothing happens, I'll remember it." The house kept its silence, holding the family in its soft, ordinary arms. And the portal gun, for the first time in forever, simply rested. Morning came quietly. The sky outside was washed in pale grey, the kind of colour that makes you wonder if the sun has truly risen, or if it's still hiding behind some distant veil. Morty sat at the kitchen table again, the same seat he had chosen the night before. The world felt strangely the same. Cereal box on the counter, hum of the refrigerator, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the pot Beth had brewed too strong. And yet, beneath all of it, there was a difference. The portal gun lay on the counter where Rick had abandoned it. Its silence seemed to fill the room, as though the absence of its hum had become another presence in the house. Even when no one looked at it, everyone knew it was there. Rick shuffled past Morty with his usual groan of morning weariness, but he didn't pick the gun up. He poured coffee, black and bitter, and stared into it like someone trying to read an answer at the bottom of the cup. Morty wanted to ask him if he was sad. But Rick's face was hard to read, caught somewhere between exhaustion and defiance. Beth moved around the kitchen, briskly, her footsteps sharp against the tile. She didn't ask about the gun either. She only reminded Morty to eat, reminded Rick to drink water, reminded Jerry to take the trash out. Small commands, holding the world together the way string holds up a kite. Summer sat across from Morty, phone still in her hand, but today she seemed quieter. She tapped her screen less often, her eyes flicking up now and then as though waiting for someone else to break the silence. And Morty, spoon in his cereal bowl, thought about how strange it was to live in a house at the edge of everything. Because that's what it felt like. Not just a house in the suburbs. Not just a kitchen with worn chairs and fading wallpaper. But a place perched at the border of worlds, holding its ground while entire galaxies had spun and collapsed just outside their windows. It was a strange kind of safety. He realized that he had always seen this house as a doorway, a place to leave from, not a place to stay. But now that the doors were closed, he wondered if maybe this had been the destination all along. Rick finally spoke, his voice gravelly. "Don't wait for it to turn back on, Morty." He didn't look up when he said it. Things don't. They don't always come back. Morty nodded. The words fell into him like stones into a pond, making ripples he didn't fully understand. But he felt the truth of them. Some things stop. Some silences never break. Later that day, Morty wandered into the garage. The air smelled of oil and faint chemicals, the floor cluttered with tools, wires, and scraps of metal. The portal gun sat alone on the workbench, its green barrel dim and lifeless. Morty touched it gently, almost expecting it to spark to life, but it didn't. The metal was cool under his fingers, not magical, not alive, just a piece of something old. He sat down in Rick's chair, the one with the torn cushion, and let himself spin slowly in circles. He remembered how many times he had been dragged out here, told to hold wires, to fetch wrenches, to keep still while Rick worked. He remembered the sound of sparks and curses, the wild thrill of being near the birth of impossible things. And he remembered, too, the quieter moments, the nights when Rick fell asleep at this bench, snoring softly, his hand still wrapped around a screwdriver. Morty stopped spinning and let the chair face the cluttered wall. Every shelf was filled with strange objects, each with a story Morty half knew. There was a glass cube that faintly glowed when you touched it, a half-assembled robot bird, jars of liquids that shimmered like melted gemstones. Morty realized that in all the running from one world to another, he had never really noticed these smaller inventions, the forgotten ones, the ones left behind because they weren't urgent enough to matter. Maybe, he thought, this was what the silence was offering, a chance to notice. He picked up a small object from the bench, a metal sphere with a single button. He didn't press it. He only held it, feeling its weight, imagining what it might do. Maybe it would light up. Maybe it would play music. Maybe it would do nothing at all. Somehow the not knowing was enough. The garage door creaked and Morty turned. Rick stood there, watching him with that same unreadable expression. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Rick walked over, took the sphere from Morty's hand, and set it back on the bench. "Not everything's meant to be used," he said quietly. Morty didn't argue. He only looked at his grandfather, noticing the lines at the edges of his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped more than they used to. Rick looked tired, yes, but there was also something softer in him. Like the silence had carved out a small hollow where rest might finally settle. That night, Morty lay in bed again, listening to the house. The sounds were the same, the refrigerator hum, the wind outside. But they felt different. They felt chosen, as though the house itself had decided to keep him company. He thought about the phrase Rick had said earlier. Things don't always come back. The words lingered in his chest as he drifted towards sleep. They didn't scare him. If anything, they made him hold on tighter to the small things, the sound of Summer's laughter through the wall, the smell of Beth's coffee, the weight of the blanket tucked under his chin. Things don't always come back, he thought, but sometimes what stays is enough. And in that soft realization, Morty let his eyes close. Outside, the stars blinked steadily like patient guardians. The portal gun remained silent in the garage, and the house at the edge of everything held the family quietly, as if rocking them all to sleep. Morty's dreams that week were softer than they used to be. There were no monsters chasing him, no impossible puzzles, no sudden crashes through alien skies. Instead, he dreamed of green sparks, the way they used to flicker when Rick pulled the trigger of the portal gun. But in the dreams, the sparks didn't open doors. They simply drifted in the air like fireflies, glowing in slow circles, settling gently on his hands, his shoulders, his hair. When he woke, he would still feel them, as though the sparks had followed him into the day. They didn't burn. They didn't even shine brightly. They simply glowed, soft and steady, reminding him that even silence carries traces of light. At breakfast one morning, Morty found himself staring at his cereal bowl, watching the milk swirl like a tiny galaxy. He thought about how much time he had spent running, through universes, through dangers, through Rick's endless schemes. And now, here he was, sitting still, watching swirls of milk. Somehow, it didn't feel small. It felt like he was finally seeing what had always been there. Rick sat across from him, hair more unkempt than usual, a shadow of stubble on his chin. He wasn't tinkering, wasn't planning, wasn't even drinking. He was just sitting, staring out the window at the pale sky. The sight made Morty's chest ache a little. There was something both fragile and strong about seeing his grandfather without motion, without noise. Did you ever? Morty began, but the words faltered. Rick glanced at him, waiting. Morty tried again. Did you ever dream about it? The sparks, I mean. The portals. Rick's eyes softened for a second, just a second, before he looked away. Dreams aren't my thing, Morty. His voice was flat, but not unkind. But you should hang on to yours, even the weird ones, especially the weird ones. Morty nodded, stirring his cereal, not sure how to respond. Sometimes Rick's words felt like puzzles, shapes that didn't quite fit together until later, when Morty turned them over in his mind. That afternoon, Morty walked through the backyard. The grass was damp, and the air smelled faintly of earth after rain. He sat down near the old wooden fence and closed his eyes. In the quiet, he remembered being smaller, running through this same yard with toy swords and makeshift shields, pretending the world was full of invisible dragons. Maybe it had always been like that, his mind turning stillness into magic. Maybe that's why the green spark stayed with him now. He thought about his childhood, the part before Rick had re-entered their lives. He remembered lonely afternoons, the sound of cartoons playing in the background, the way his heart sometimes ached without knowing why. Then Rick had come, and suddenly the world was bigger than he had ever imagined. Too big, maybe. The kind of big that swallows you whole if you don't hold on tight. And yet, Morty realized he wasn't afraid of losing that vastness anymore. The sparks in his dreams reminded him that wonder didn't need doors. It lived inside him, even here in the quiet yard, even in the damp smell of grass. Summer came outside, phone in her hand, but she didn't say anything right away. She leaned against the fence beside him, scrolling absently. Morty kept his eyes closed, but he could feel her presence like warmth. "You've been different," she said finally. Her voice wasn't mocking, it was softer than usual. Morty opened his eyes. "Different how?" "Quieter," Summer said. She glanced at him, then back at her phone. "Like, you're not waiting for him to grab you and drag you off anymore, like you're actually here." Morty thought about it. She wasn't wrong. For so long, he had lived with half his body ready to leap into another dimension, half his heart tethered to adventures that might come without warning. Now, for the first time, he felt grounded, present. The stillness wasn't emptiness, it was belonging. "I guess," Morty murmured, looking at the grass. "It feels different now, like I can just sit here and it's enough." Summer didn't answer right away. She only tucked her phone into her pocket and sat down in the grass beside him. They didn't speak for a long while, and that silence felt heavier than words, comfortable, shared, like a blanket draped over them both. That night, Morty dreamed again. The sparks swirled around him, but this time he wasn't alone. Summer was there too, standing beside him, her face calm, her eyes lit with the glow. They didn't speak in the dream, but Morty felt something between them, something strong and steady, like roots growing deep. When he woke, he smiled faintly, the dream still clinging to him like dew on morning grass. In the garage, Rick was tinkering again, not with the portal gun, but with something smaller, simpler. Morty stood in the doorway for a while, just watching. Rick's movements were slower than they used to be, less frantic, almost meditative. "What are you making?" Morty finally asked. Rick didn't look up. "Doesn't matter, might not even work." Morty stepped closer, peering at the tiny wires, the delicate glass. "Looks like a light." Rick paused, glanced at him, then returned to his work. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just junk." But Morty saw the faintest flicker in Rick's eyes, the same flicker he had seen in his own dreams. A green spark, softened now, quieter, but still alive. And for the first time, Morty thought, maybe the silence wasn't just for him. Maybe it was teaching Rick too, teaching him how to sit, how to rest, how to build something not for escape, but for light. That night, Morty fell asleep with the image of his grandfather's tired hands, shaping something gentle. And in his dreams, the sparks glowed warmer than ever. Not just fireflies now, but little lanterns floating in the dark, guiding him forward into a world where silence had become a kind of song. The silence lingered in the house, but Morty found that silence had a way of opening doors inside the mind. With no portals tugging him across galaxies, his thoughts began to wander back through memory, gentle revisits to places he might never see again. They came to him not as sharp, detailed images, but as echoes, soft ripples in the night. One evening, as he lay awake staring at the fading glow of his ceiling stars, Morty remembered the crystal forest. He couldn't recall which world it had been or what danger they had faced there, but the memory of light clung to him. Trees of glass rising tall as cathedrals, each one shimmering in soft blues and greens, their branches chiming against each other in the wind. He remembered walking beneath them, his footsteps careful, and hearing his own reflection of awe in the sound of summer's quiet gasp. The forest returned to him now like a dream half remembered. He didn't need the details. The echo was enough. The shimmer, the chime, the way the air had smelled faintly of rain, even though no clouds had been above them. Another night, he dreamed of the city where the sky itself had spoken. He couldn't recall the words, only the deep vibration of the air, as if every breath was a note in a song too large for human ears. He remembered Rick smirking at the phenomenon, calling it cheap theatrics, but Morty had felt something else, something almost holy. A sky that spoke was a sky that noticed you. And the echo of that noticing had stayed with him, tucked somewhere beneath his ribs. These memories came not with urgency, but with gentleness, as though reminding Morty that even if doors never opened again, the places they had seen would still live in him. Worlds don't die, he realized. They leave echoes, and those echoes, if you listen closely enough, can be louder than the present. One afternoon, Morty sat at the kitchen table, sketching absent shapes on the back of a napkin. He found himself drawing spirals, stars, trees with crystal branches. Summer passed behind him and paused, leaning down to glance at his doodles. "Those places again?" she asked softly. Morty nodded. "Yeah, it's weird. I don't remember them all the way, just little pieces, like when you wake up and the dream slips away but you still feel it." Summer tilted her head. Maybe that's all they were supposed to be, not whole stories, just pieces that stay with you. Her words sank into Morty like drops of water into dry soil. He hadn't thought of it that way. Maybe the forgetting wasn't loss, maybe it was mercy. The sharp edges of fear, confusion, danger, those were fading, but the beauty, the awe, the wonder, those lingered, like a song you don't remember the lyrics to, but whose tune still makes your chest ache. That evening, Rick came into the kitchen carrying a bottle of something strong. He didn't say anything about Morty's drawings, but his eyes lingered on the napkin for a moment too long. Then he poured himself a glass and sat down heavily in the chair beside Morty. "You think you're going to remember all of it, Morty?" Rick's voice was rough, almost careless, but there was something behind it. Morty hesitated. "Not all of it, just parts, the good parts." Rick huffed, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "Good luck with that. Memory doesn't take orders. It'll keep what it wants." Morty looked down at the napkin. Yeah, but I don't know, even if it fades, it still feels like it's there, like an echo, you know? Rick didn't respond. He only sipped his drink, eyes fixed on the far wall. But Morty thought he saw something soften in his grandfather's expression, something like agreement that would never be spoken aloud. That night, Morty dreamed of the cavern of mirrors. He remembered stepping inside, every surface reflecting not just his body but versions of himself, older, younger, braver, weaker. At the time, it had terrified him. Now, in the dream, it only felt tender. He saw himself not as broken pieces but as many faces of the same boy, each one carrying its own kind of strength. When he woke, his chest felt lighter. Days passed quietly, but the echoes kept coming. Some were small, the taste of alien fruit that had been both sweet and bitter, the sight of moons stacked like coins in the sky. Others were larger, the sound of Rick's laughter echoing off cavern walls, the way Summer's hand had once grabbed his in panic, holding tight. Morty began to notice something. The echoes were less about places, more about people. The worlds blurred, but the feelings remained. Rick's gruff protection, Summer's stubborn courage, Beth's rare moments of softness, even Jerry's clumsy attempts at humor. The worlds themselves faded, but the family that had walked through them stayed vivid. One evening, Morty sat in the backyard again, the air heavy with the scent of summer grass. He closed his eyes and tried to let the echoes come. He thought of the forest, the city, the cavern, the moons. But in every memory, he realized, he wasn't alone. The beauty of those places had always been tied to who was beside him. Summer stepped outside, her footsteps soft on the porch. She didn't say anything, just sat beside him again. After a while, she whispered, "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Morty shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Maybe not, but maybe we don't have to. Maybe seeing them once is enough." Summer leaned back on her hands, looking at the darkening sky. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I guess echoes are better than nothing." The stars above them blinked steadily as if agreeing. And for a long while they sat in silence, listening not to the present, but to the faint reverberations of everything they had once seen together. That night, Morty fell asleep with the feeling that echoes are not less than the real thing. Sometimes echoes are gentler. Sometimes they're all that's left, and that makes them precious. The house held them, steady as always. The portal gun slept on the workbench, and Morty, dreaming of green sparks and chiming forests, felt the echoes carrying him into rest. It was an ordinary afternoon when it happened, ordinary in every way that matters. The sky outside was pale and cloudless, the hum of traffic faint beyond the fence, and the air in the kitchen was filled with the familiar sound of plates being shifted, drawers being opened and closed. Morty sat at the table, chin resting on his hand, while Beth moved around preparing lunch. Jerry was trying to fix the dripping faucet, muttering to himself, though nothing improved with each twist of the wrench. Summer scrolled her phone again, her sighs steady as a metronome. And Rick? He wasn't in the room. He hadn't been for most of the day. On the counter sat a loaf of bread, a jar of mustard, and slices of cheese laid out carelessly on a plate. Beth slapped 2 pieces of bread together with practiced ease, set the sandwich on the table in front of Morty, and told him to eat. She didn't even look up when she said it. Morty blinked at the sandwich. It was nothing special. White bread, slightly stale, cheese uneven, mustard too heavy on one side. But something about it caught him. He stared at it for a long moment, his spoon resting in his hand, like he had forgotten what he was supposed to do with it. He thought about all the places he had eaten before, markets floating in the air, banquets in alien castles, snacks stolen while running from danger. And here, in this quiet kitchen, the most ordinary sandwich in the world sat waiting for him. Somehow it felt heavier than all of those feasts combined. Summer noticed his stare. "What? Did the sandwich do something?" she teased, but her voice wasn't sharp. It was curious, almost gentle. Morty shook his head slowly. "No, it's just... I don't know, it's... real, it's here." She raised an eyebrow. "It's a sandwich, Morty. You're acting like it's holy or something." But maybe it was. Morty picked it up, the bread soft beneath his fingers, and took a slow bite. The taste was plain, comforting. Nothing sparkled, nothing changed, and yet as he chewed, he felt a strange wave of gratitude rise in him. Gratitude that he was here, in this house, eating something his mother had made without ceremony, surrounded by the ordinary noise of his family. Rick shuffled in halfway through Morty's second bite. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at Morty, then at the sandwich, then grunted as he poured himself a drink. But Morty caught the flicker of something in Rick's eyes, recognition maybe, like he understood what Morty was feeling without needing to hear it. Beth sat down at the table at last, sipping water, eyes tired. Jerry gave up on the faucet and collapsed into a chair, muttering about tools that don't cooperate. Summer finally put her phone down and picked up an apple instead. For a few moments, they all sat together in the same silence. Not the kind of silence that weighed them down, but the kind that made them feel tied to each other in invisible threads. Morty chewed his sandwich slowly, savoring each bite like it was the first food he'd ever tasted. The ordinariness was its own miracle. For so long, food had been rushed, grabbed between worlds, eaten while running, devoured in exhaustion. This sandwich asked for nothing except to be eaten here, now, in the calm of the kitchen. "Good?" Beth asked absently, though her eyes softened when Morty nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Really good." No one pressed him further. The moment didn't need explanation. It simply lived, and that was enough. Later, Morty went outside with Summer, the two of them carrying their snacks into the backyard. The afternoon sun had stretched thin, pale gold settling on the fence and grass. Summer leaned against the railing, apple in hand, while Morty sat cross-legged on the grass, finishing the last bite of his sandwich. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Morty shrugged. "It just, felt important." "Sometimes boring is important," Summer said. "You don't realize it until you've had too much not boring." Her words sank into Morty like stones dropped into water. He thought about all the chaos, all the strange worlds, and how they had once made him feel small. Now, sitting in the yard with his sister, and the last taste of mustard fading on his tongue, he felt not small, but steady, grounded. As if life itself was reminding him, the extraordinary isn't always out there. Sometimes it's just bread and cheese. That night, Morty lay in bed thinking of the sandwich again. He laughed at himself a little. It was silly, maybe, to hold on to something so small. But the more he thought about it, the less silly it felt. The sandwich was proof that even when doors stop opening, life continues. Ordinary, imperfect, beautiful. He closed his eyes, and in the quiet of his room, the memory of the taste lingered like a lullaby. The house hummed gently around him, the stars watched through his window, and the echo of the day's simplicity wrapped him in sleep. For the first time in a long time, Morty dreamed not of sparks, not of faraway places, but of the kitchen table, his family gathered, plates and cups scattered, laughter faint, silence steady. A moment so small it might have been overlooked, yet large enough to hold him through the night. Rick was never a man of silence, not really. His life had been stitched together with noise, machines whirring, bottles clinking, words spilling from his mouth faster than anyone could catch them. Even when he wasn't talking, his presence filled rooms with a restless energy, like a storm threatening to break. But lately, Morty noticed something different. His grandfather had grown quiet. At first, it was only in small ways. The garage stayed dark for longer stretches of time. The clatter of tools, once as constant as a heartbeat, no longer echoed through the house. Rick sat at the table more often, staring into space as if watching something no one else could see. It wasn't the silence of anger, nor the silence of plotting. It was a deeper kind, heavy yet soft. A silence that seemed to press gently against the air, asking to be noticed. Morty felt it most at the dinner table. The family would eat in their ordinary way, Beth reminding Jerry not to talk with his mouth full, Summer tossing in sharp remarks, Morty chewing slowly, and Rick would sit there, shoulders slumped, fork moving absently between plate and mouth, eyes fixed not on his food, but on some faraway point. Sometimes Morty tried to break the quiet. "So, school was fine today," he would say, or "Did you ever fix that light in the garage, Rick?" But Rick rarely answered. At most, a grunt, a nod, the kind of reply that was more acknowledgement than conversation. At first, Morty worried. Was Rick angry, sick, giving up? The thoughts gnawed at him until one evening he gathered the courage to ask, "Rick, are you okay?" Rick looked up from his plate, blinking as though the question had pulled him back from somewhere deep. For a moment, his expression was unreadable. Then he shrugged. "Depends on your definition of okay, Morty." His voice was softer than usual, lacking its usual sharp edges. Morty wanted to press further, but something in Rick's eyes stopped him. They weren't empty, they were searching almost. Like a man standing at the edge of an ocean watching the waves roll in, knowing he could no longer swim the way he once had. So Morty didn't push. He let the silence return, and for the first time, he tried to sit inside it rather than escape it. That night, lying in bed, Morty thought about how much space silence could hold. Rick's quiet wasn't empty. It was full of memories Morty couldn't see, mistakes he couldn't understand, love Rick didn't know how to name. The silence was a language of its own. And maybe, Morty thought, if he listened carefully enough, he might begin to understand it. The next day, Morty sat in the garage while Rick tinkered with something small. Not the portal gun, but another gadget, half-built and glowing faintly. Rick didn't say a word as Morty settled into a stool nearby. For a while, the only sounds were the scratch of metal and the occasional clink of glass. Morty found the stillness oddly soothing. He thought of all the times he had begged Rick to explain, demanded answers to questions that twisted his brain. Now he simply watched, letting the silence fill the space between them like water filling a glass. After a long while, Rick spoke without looking up. "You don't have to sit here, Morty." "I know," Morty said quietly. "I want to." Rick's hands paused on the wires. He didn't look at Morty, but the corners of his mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. Then he bent back over his work. Morty smiled faintly. He realized that this, just sitting together, no worlds to save, no danger pressing in, was its own kind of adventure. Not the kind that burned in memory with bright sparks, but the kind that seeped in slowly, like warm tea spreading through the body. That evening at dinner, Morty noticed the silence again, but this time, instead of feeling like a void, it felt like a presence. Rick's silence wasn't pushing them away. It was holding them, carrying the weight of things unsaid so no one else had to. Beth must have felt it too because she softened her tone, asking Rick if he wanted more food, in a voice gentler than usual. Jerry, sensing the atmosphere, told fewer jokes. Even Summer, instead of filling the gap with sarcasm, simply ate quietly, her eyes flicking now and then toward her grandfather. And Morty thought, maybe this was Rick's way of loving them. Not in big speeches, not in dramatic gestures, just in being here, sitting with them, letting the silence carry what words could not. Later that night, Morty lay awake listening to the house breathe. He thought about all the noise they had lived through together. Shouts, alarms, explosions, laughter, arguments. And now, this hush. It wasn't the end of everything. It was simply another chapter, a softer one, a slower one. And as he drifted into sleep, Morty whispered to himself, as if answering a question no one had asked. Yeah, silence can be okay. The stars outside blinked patiently as though agreeing. And somewhere in the house, Rick's silence stretched like a blanket, covering them all in its quiet weight. It began so gently, Morty almost didn't notice. A small feeling in the pit of his stomach, like a candle being lit in a dark room. Nothing bright, nothing loud, just a flicker. He had been walking home from school when it first rose up. The afternoon light was soft, slanting through the trees, and the air smelled faintly of damp leaves. Morty carried his backpack, his steps dragging, when suddenly he stopped. For no reason he could explain, he felt the need to pause on the corner before crossing the street. A moment later, a car sped past, too fast, too close. Had he stepped out when he'd intended, he might have been hit. Morty stood there in stunned silence, heart beating fast, and whispered to himself, "Huh." It didn't feel like luck. It felt like something else, something that had been waiting inside him, quiet, patient, until now. Over the next few days, the feeling returned in small ways. He would know which hallway to take to avoid the crowd. He would sense when Summer was about to walk into his room, giving him a moment to hide his drawings. He even knew when Beth would be in a gentler mood, when asking her for help with homework wouldn't be met with a distracted sigh. At first, Morty brushed it off. Coincidence, maybe. But deep down, he knew better. He had traveled to countless worlds, faced countless dangers, and survived more than he should have. Maybe all of that had left something inside him, something quieter than courage, less visible than strength, a kind of intuition, a soft knowing. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Morty sat quietly on the floor. Summer flipped through channels, Jerry laughed too loudly at a commercial, Beth scrolled through her messages. Rick sat in his chair, eyes half closed, drink in hand. Morty felt the flicker again, a sense that Rick was about to say something. He looked up, and sure enough, Rick opened his mouth. "You ever notice," Rick murmured, voice slow, "that sometimes the best thing you can do is nothing?" The words hung in the air. Jerry blinked, Beth tilted her head, Summer smirked, as though expecting more, but Rick said nothing else. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the silence return. Morty shivered. He had felt it before it happened. Not just a guess, but a knowing, like his chest had whispered to him. "Listen, something's coming." That night, Morty lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought of the car rushing by, of the hallways, of Rick's quiet remark. This gift, if that's what it was, wasn't flashy. It wasn't a weapon, it was something softer, a voice beneath the noise. The next day, Morty tested it. At lunch, he sat with his tray and waited. He felt the flicker again, telling him to look up just before a friend called his name across the cafeteria. He smiled faintly, feeling less surprised than he might have once been. It wasn't always right. Sometimes he felt the flicker, and nothing happened. But even then it left him calmer, as though listening itself had meaning. One evening, Morty told Summer about it in the backyard. The air was cool, stars faint above them, the hum of the neighborhood soft around. I think I can, I don't know, sense things, just little things. Summer looked at him, eyebrow raised. You mean like psychic powers, or like lucky guesses? Neither, Morty said softly. More like, I can hear something inside me, like a quiet voice, not words, just feelings. Summer bit into her apple, chewing thoughtfully. Well, that's kind of cool. Better than being oblivious all the time. Morty laughed nervously. Yeah, I guess so. She nudged him with her elbow. Don't make it a big deal. Just use it when it feels right. Morty nodded. Her advice, simple as it was, felt like a key turning in a lock. He didn't need to understand this gift fully, he just needed to trust it. Over the next weeks, Morty practiced listening, at school, at home, in the quiet of his room. Sometimes he closed his eyes and simply breathed, waiting to see if the flicker came. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But the practice itself was soothing, like sitting at the edge of a lake and watching the ripples. Rick noticed eventually. One evening in the garage, he glanced at Morty, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes half closed. What are you doing, Morty? Meditating or something? Morty opened his eyes slowly. Just listening. Rick snorted. To what? Morty hesitated, then he said softly, to what's inside. Rick stared at him for a long moment. His face, usually unreadable, flickered with something Morty couldn't name. Then Rick turned back to his tools, muttering, not the worst habit. It wasn't praise, not exactly. But it wasn't dismissal either, and for Morty that was enough. That night, Morty sat at the window of his room, looking at the stars. He thought about all the times he had depended on Rick's brilliance, on machines, on wild inventions, and now, for the first time, he was learning to depend on something quieter, something within. It wasn't power, it wasn't control, it was simply presence, the ability to hear the whisper of a moment before it passed. As Morty drifted to sleep, he thought of the candle in the dark, the flicker of intuition, fragile perhaps, but enough to light his way. And somewhere in the house, Rick sat alone, a faint smile tugging at his lips as though he too had felt that flicker. The days slipped by quietly, like pages turning in a book Morty wasn't sure he had chosen to read, but couldn't stop following. His new gift, the flicker of intuition, wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic. It was more like a subtle music beneath everything. A hum that sometimes swelled when he paid attention. A hum that connected him to others in ways he hadn't before. He first noticed it with Beth. She had been standing at the kitchen counter, shoulders tight, her fingers tapping impatiently on her phone. Morty wandered in, hungry, searching for a snack. Before he even opened the fridge, the flicker stirred in his chest, telling him not to ask her for anything just yet. So he didn't. He waited. Moments later, Beth sighed, set her phone down, and looked over at him. Her eyes softened. Do you need help with homework, sweetie? Morty blinked. He hadn't even asked, but she seemed relieved, almost grateful, that he hadn't spoken too soon. That tiny pause had changed the mood. Morty realized then the gift wasn't just for him. It was a way of listening to others, a language without words. With Jerry, it worked differently. Jerry was full of nervous chatter, always filling silence with half-formed thoughts. Usually, Morty ignored him, but one evening, while Jerry droned on about a new job application, Morty felt the flicker again, gentle, steady, telling him to simply nod at the right moment. Morty did, and Jerry lit up. smiling in a way Morty rarely saw. For once, his father felt heard. Even with Summer, who seemed so distant sometimes, Morty noticed things. A small hesitation in her steps, the way her laughter dimmed when her friends left. One night, as she scrolled on her phone in bed, Morty tapped softly on her door. He didn't have anything to say, not really, but he stepped in and sat on the floor. Summer looked at him, puzzled at first, then rolled her eyes with a smirk. "You're weird, you know that?" she said. But she didn't tell him to leave. Instead, she kept scrolling, her room filled with a different kind of silence. Comfortable, shared. Morty didn't need to speak. His presence was enough. And with Rick, the language grew stranger, more difficult. Rick didn't speak in ways Morty could predict. His moods swung like doors in a storm. But the flicker helped Morty feel the spaces in between. When Rick was drinking in silence, Morty knew not to interrupt. When Rick mumbled a thought half to himself, Morty knew when to lean closer and when to leave it untouched. It was almost like learning a song together. Rick played in wild chords and broken rhythms, and Morty added small notes of patience, of stillness. The music wasn't perfect, but it was real. One night in the garage, Rick worked at his bench, tools scattered like constellations across the table. Morty sat nearby, doodling absent-mindedly on scrap paper. The flicker stirred. Morty looked up just as Rick muttered, almost under his breath, "It's not the portals I miss. It's the possibility, the noise." Morty didn't reply. He didn't ask questions. He only let the words land like seeds falling into soil. Rick glanced at him briefly, then returned to his work. And though nothing more was said, Morty felt the quiet hum between them, the rare language of simply being there. The more Morty practiced this kind of listening, the more he realized how much had always gone unnoticed. The sighs in Summer's laughter, the stillness behind Beth's sharp words, the way Jerry's stories weren't about jobs or applications at all. They were about wanting to feel useful. And Rick's endless inventions, his noise, his brilliance. Beneath it was a man who feared silence more than he admitted. Morty lay awake some nights thinking about it. The house had always felt loud. Arguments, television, Rick's machines, his own racing heart. Now it felt different, softer, like all that noise had a rhythm and he was finally learning to hear it. One evening, after dinner, Morty walked out to the backyard. The air was cool, the grass damp beneath his shoes. He tilted his head back to the stars, stickers of his childhood ceiling replaced by the endless ones above. The flicker stirred again. Not a warning, not a signal, just a soft presence, reminding him that even the stars had their quiet language. Rick joined him after a while, stepping out with a flask in his hand. He didn't speak at first, and Morty didn't either. They stood side by side, looking at the same sky. Then Rick said, voice low, "Universe doesn't care about us, Morty." "Never has, never will." Morty's chest warmed with the flicker. For once he didn't feel the need to argue. He only said softly, "Maybe, but we can care about each other." Rick turned his head slightly, studying him. The old man's eyes were tired, glassy, but there was a glimmer there too, like the reflection of a distant star. He didn't reply, but his silence wasn't rejection. It was agreement, in the only way Rick knew how to give it. That night, Morty returned to bed with a strange peace in his heart. The language between them wasn't made of words. It was made of pauses, of presences, of things left unsaid but understood. And as he drifted into sleep, Morty thought, maybe this was the real adventure all along. Not the portals, not the chaos, but the quiet art of listening. Morty began to notice something he hadn't before. When you start listening to others differently, you can't help but start hearing yourself too. The quiet language he had been learning with his family didn't only flow outward, it curved back toward him like a mirror, showing him pieces of himself he'd never stopped to see. It happened one morning in the bathroom, of all places. He was brushing his teeth, staring at his reflection in the fogged-up mirror. For a long time, he had only seen the same awkward boy, messy hair, tired eyes, a face that never quite matched the confidence he wished he had. But now, something else appeared. In his reflection, he saw not just what he looked like, but the way he felt. A little softer, a little more at ease. His shoulders weren't hunched as tightly. His eyes seemed quieter, less frantic. He almost laughed. Could simply listening, simply sitting in silence, really change him this much? That day at school, he caught himself doing it again. His teacher droned on, her voice a steady hum, and Morty felt the flicker stir in his chest. Instead of fidgeting, instead of letting boredom drag him down, he leaned into it. He noticed the way her hands moved when she spoke, the rhythm of her voice, the effort in her eyes. She wasn't just teaching a subject, she was trying every day to reach students who barely looked back at her. Morty nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly. The teacher noticed, and for a brief second, her face softened in gratitude before she continued. Morty felt the warmth in his chest again. A small exchange, a quiet gift. At lunch, his friends bickered over video games and test answers. Normally, Morty would have jumped in, arguing his point, trying to prove himself. But instead, he just listened, hearing the tones behind their words. One friend wasn't angry at all, just tired. Another wasn't gloating, just nervous, hiding it with noise. Morty smiled softly. It was like hearing a song beneath the chatter, a harmony no one else caught. When he spoke, his words came slower, simpler. And strangely enough, the group leaned toward him when he did. They listened, even when he said very little. Morty realized sometimes quietness carried more weight than all the shouting in the world. That evening, walking home, Morty thought about how much he had changed. Rick had always been the loudest force in his life, pulling him from one dimension to another, from disaster to miracle and back again. But now Rick was quieter too, and Morty was beginning to see himself not as a shadow following his grandfather, but as something steady, something his family could lean on. When he walked through the front door, Jerry was fumbling with a toolbox, trying and failing to fix the kitchen faucet. Water dripped steadily, splashing in the sink. Jerry muttered, half to himself, half to anyone listening, "I'll get it this time. Just need the right wrench." The flicker in Morty's chest stirred. He wanted to tell his dad he'd never fix it, that Rick could do it in 5 seconds flat. But instead, Morty walked over, crouched down, and handed Jerry the right tool without saying a word. Jerry's face lit up with surprise, then pride. "Thanks, son," he said softly. Morty smiled. That was enough. Later, in his room, Morty lay on his bed staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars still clinging to his ceiling. They were faded now, peeling at the edges. He thought about how much time he had spent wishing he could run away with Rick forever, across galaxies, leaving Earth and its dullness behind. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe adventure wasn't only out there. Maybe adventure could be found in silence, in reflection, in seeing the people around him more clearly. Maybe, Morty thought with a sleepy smile, adventure had been hiding in plain sight all along. He thought about Rick, his silence, his mutterings, the way he had admitted missing the noise. Morty realized his own role was shifting. Rick had always been the storm, but Morty could be the mirror. The quiet mirror, reflecting back not judgment, but understanding. The thought calmed him. It soothed him more deeply than any portal ever had. That night, as Morty drifted into dreams, he felt the house breathing around him. Beth sighing faintly in her room. Jerry snoring unevenly. Summer's music humming through her headphones. Rick in the garage, a faint clink of glass, and the low hum of something unfinished. Each sound fit into place, forming a song only Morty could hear. A song of a family learning, slowly, to live in silence together. And Morty, in the center of it all, listened with a heart that was finally beginning to feel whole. Rick never said it outright, but Morty began to notice the old man testing him. Not with grand experiments or dangerous escapades, those had ended with the silence of the portal gun, but with smaller, quieter moments. Little challenges that seemed insignificant at first, but carried a weight Morty could feel in his chest. It started one evening in the garage. Rick was fiddling with a half-finished contraption, wires hanging loose, lights blinking faintly in the shadows. Morty sat on a stool nearby, watching without interrupting. Then, without looking up, Rick muttered, "Hey, Morty, hand me the 12mm socket." Morty blinked. The workbench was cluttered with dozens of tools, scattered without order. Normally he would have panicked, fumbling through them, hoping Rick wouldn't snap. But something inside told him to pause, to listen. The flicker stirred gently in his chest. He breathed. Then his hand drifted to a socket near the edge, as if guided by something quiet and unseen. He passed it to Rick. Rick took it without a word, but a moment later Morty noticed the corner of his grandfather's mouth twitch upward, almost a smile. The tests grew stranger. One afternoon, Rick sat in the living room with the television blaring static. Morty asked if he wanted him to fix it. Rick grunted, "Nah, just sit." Morty sat. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Rick didn't move. The room filled with static, with silence, with Morty's own restless thoughts. But the flicker told him not to fidget, not to force words. So he stayed, quiet, present. Finally, Rick turned the TV off, stood up, and walked away. "Good," he muttered. Morty didn't know what had been tested, but he felt like he had passed. Another time, Rick placed 2 vials of glowing liquid on the counter. "One's harmless, one'll knock you on your ass for a week," he said flatly. "Pick." Morty froze, staring at the shimmering blues and greens. His first instinct was to ask which was which, to demand an answer. But the flicker in his chest told him to look closer. The blue shimmered with an unstable light, jittering at the edges. The green, though strange, was steady. Morty pointed to the green. Rick chuckled low, shaking his head. "Huh, you're learning." He poured the green liquid into a flask, drank it himself, and walked out of the room without explanation. Morty sat there, stunned, realizing he'd been right. But more than that, realizing Rick had trusted him with a choice. It wasn't about the socket, or the static, or the vials. Morty understood now. Rick wasn't testing his knowledge. He was testing his patience, his steadiness, his ability to see beyond the surface. And with each small test, Morty felt himself growing. Not into Rick, not into some wild genius traveling galaxies, but into himself. Into someone calmer, sturdier, someone who didn't crumble under silence. The most difficult test came on a rainy night. Rick appeared at Morty's door, smelling faintly of engine oil and whiskey. He held something small in his hand, a cube, no bigger than a fist, pulsing with dim light. He tossed it onto Morty's desk. "Don't touch it," Rick said, his voice heavier than usual. "Just leave it there." Morty frowned. "What is it?" Rick waved him off. "It doesn't matter, just don't touch it." Then he left. The cube sat there, glowing faintly in the darkness. Morty lay in bed, staring at it. Hours passed. The flicker in his chest stirred with unease. Curiosity whispered at him, louder and louder. What harm could come from a single glance, a single touch? He almost reached for it more than once, his hand trembling above the surface, but each time the flicker hummed gently, "Wait." By morning, the cube was gone. Rick never mentioned it again. But that morning, when Morty entered the garage, Rick handed him a screwdriver and said simply, "You did good, kid." Morty realized then it wasn't about resisting curiosity or obeying orders. It was about trust. Rick had wanted to see if Morty could hold steady through uncertainty, and Morty had. These small tests didn't make Morty feel proud in a loud way. They didn't fill him with victory or glory. They filled him with something deeper, a quiet confidence, like roots settling into soil. He wasn't the same boy who once stumbled after Rick, desperate for direction. He was becoming someone who could stand still, even when the world trembled. That evening, Morty stepped outside into the backyard again. The rain had cleared, leaving the air heavy and clean. The grass shimmered with drops of silver. He tilted his head back to the sky, where the clouds parted just enough to show a scatter of stars. He thought about Rick, about the silence of the portal gun, about the way life had shifted since that day. The universe had once felt like a storm dragging him along. Now it felt slower, softer, a river he could float upon without fear. And as he stood there, Morty whispered softly to himself, as if practicing the language he had been learning all along. "I can listen. I can wait. I can be." The stars didn't answer, but in their silence, Morty felt them listening back. Rick had always carried himself like the center of the storm, the genius, the reckless one, the orbit around which everyone else spun helplessly. Morty knew that role well. He had been dragged through it for years, following Rick into danger, watching him wrestle with problems too vast to comprehend. Rick had always been the one with the answers, even when his answers burned holes in the world. But lately, Morty noticed something changing. The weight was shifting. It began in the smallest ways. In the garage one afternoon, Rick leaned back in his chair, staring at a diagram scrawled across 3 sheets of paper. His eyes were glazed, tired. Morty had seen that look before, the look Rick wore when he carried something heavy in his mind, something he wouldn't dare say out loud. Normally, Morty would have filled the silence with questions, or waited anxiously for Rick to bark orders. But instead, Morty just sat across from him, hands folded, breathing quietly. After a long while, Rick glanced up, grumbled something, and pushed the papers toward him. "Tell me what you see." Morty blinked. He wasn't a scientist. He couldn't possibly understand the tangled equations and sketches. But Rick didn't seem to want an answer like that. Morty studied the pages the way he had been practicing, listening with his chest, not his mind. After a moment, he said softly, "It looks like you're tired of fixing things that never stay fixed." Rick froze. His pen slipped from his hand and rolled across the table. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Morty's words had landed somewhere deep, and for the first time, Morty realized Rick wasn't looking for brilliance. He was looking for reflection. From that day forward, Rick's eyes began to rest on Morty more often, not always with expectation, but sometimes with quiet reliance. The roles were shifting, subtly, tenderly. Rick, the storm, was leaning on Morty, the mirror. One evening after dinner, Beth and Jerry were arguing in the kitchen about bills. Summer stomped upstairs, headphones blaring. Morty lingered in the hallway, uncertain. He saw Rick standing by the garage door, flask in hand, watching the scene play out with his usual detached frown. But then Rick turned. caught Morty's eye and gave a small nod toward the family. It wasn't a command, it was a question. "Can you hold them steady?" Morty stepped into the kitchen. He didn't lecture, didn't scold. He just listened. Beth's voice cracked with exhaustion. Jerry's hands trembled with shame. Morty let them both speak, let them both unravel their fear. And when they were quiet, he said simply, "You're both just scared. That's all. And it's okay." The room stilled. His parents exchanged a look. Something in them softened. From the doorway, Morty caught a glimpse of Rick's face. There was no smirk, no sarcasm, only a slow, solemn respect. Morty didn't realize how deeply the shift had taken root until one night he found Rick sitting alone in the garage, staring at the silent portal gun. The device lay on the workbench like a relic, dust collecting around it. Rick's shoulders were slumped, his hands hung heavy at his sides. For once, he didn't look like a man who had conquered galaxies. He looked like a man who had lost something he could never replace. Morty sat down beside him. No words, just presence. The silence stretched long. Then Rick spoke, his voice softer than Morty had ever heard it. "You know, for the longest time I thought I had to keep everything moving. Keep building, keep running, keep outsmarting it all. 'Cause if I stopped..." His voice cracked faintly. "And then I'd have to feel it." Morty turned, studying his grandfather's face. The lines seemed deeper, the eyes more fragile. The storm was quieting, and in its place was a man who didn't know how to rest. "It's okay to stop," Morty whispered. "You don't have to do it alone." Rick blinked, as if startled by the words. For a moment, Morty thought he might laugh it off, but instead Rick set the flask down slowly, rubbed his face, and let out a long breath. It wasn't surrender, it wasn't defeat. It was something softer, a trust handed over quietly in the dim light of the garage. From then on, Morty carried the weight differently. He began noticing that Rick would look at him not for answers, but for steadiness. Morty, who once tripped over every word, was becoming the anchor Rick reached for in silence. The weight had shifted, and Morty, to his own surprise, was ready to carry it. That night, as Morty drifted into sleep, he thought about how strange it felt that the boy who once followed Rick through storms was now holding part of the storm himself. It didn't feel frightening, it didn't feel heavy, it felt right. And in the hush of the house, Morty smiled faintly to himself, knowing that sometimes the greatest journey wasn't chasing the stars, but learning how to be still when someone you love finally rests. Rick rarely spoke about his past. His stories were always about inventions, disasters, escapes, loud tales of science and chaos that never reached the quiet heart beneath them. But one late night, as Morty sat with him in the garage, Rick began to let small fragments slip, like broken pieces of glass catching the light. The portal gun lay silent on the workbench, as it often did now. Rick poured himself a drink, then paused, staring into the amber liquid as though it held memories too heavy to swallow. Morty waited. He had learned patience, that words came easier to Rick when silence gave them room. After a long while, Rick murmured, "You ever notice how stars look different depending on where you stand? Not the constellations, but the brightness. Some look closer, some further, but they're all the same light. Just perspective." Morty tilted his head, unsure where this was going. But Rick's eyes weren't on him. They were far away. "There was a time," Rick continued, "when I used to chart those differences. Spent weeks in one system, months in another, mapping how each world saw the same star. I thought, If I could piece it together, I'd finally see the whole thing. One perfect sky. He chuckled low, but there was no humor in it. Never finished. Too many worlds, too many me's. Morty stayed quiet, letting the weight of it settle. Rick rarely spoke in this way, without armor, without the edge of sarcasm. Another night, Morty found Rick sitting outside, leaning against the shed. The air smelled faintly of grass and rain. A half-empty flask sat beside him, untouched. "Morty," Rick said softly, "you ever lose something before you even had the chance to hold it?" Morty frowned. "What do you mean?" Rick picked up the flask, turned it in his hands, then set it down again. His voice lowered, almost breaking. "I built so many things, tried so many paths, but there were some people I never built the right bridge to, some doors I never opened, and now—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Now those doors are just walls." Morty didn't know the names, he didn't know the stories, but he knew the feeling, the ache of something lost too soon. He leaned against Rick's shoulder, not speaking, letting presence speak louder than words. Rick didn't pull away. For once, he let someone stay. Over the following weeks, fragments trickled out in similar ways. Rick mentioned a planet where the sunsets lasted 3 hours, and how he used to watch them with someone who never forgave him. He recalled the laughter of a friend he had abandoned in the middle of an experiment gone wrong. He even admitted one night in a whisper that sometimes the silence of the portal gun felt like a punishment he deserved. Each fragment felt like a shard, sharp enough to wound, yet fragile enough to break if handled wrong. Morty never pressed, never asked for more. He just held them carefully, as if gathering pieces of stained glass that once formed a window. And slowly, Rick began to trust him with larger shards. One evening, as thunder rumbled far off, Rick said quietly, "You know, Morty, I wasn't always this way. There was a time I thought building things would save me, that if I created enough, machines, portals, universes, it would all add up to something, meaning maybe, or forgiveness." He swallowed hard, staring at the floor. But the truth is, all it added up to was distance, and the further I went, the less I recognized myself. Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to tell Rick it wasn't too late, that he still recognized him, but the flicker in his chest told him not to. Words like that would bounce off Rick's armor. Instead, Morty placed his hand on Rick's arm. A steady touch. Quiet, certain. Rick's shoulders eased. He let out a breath he'd been holding for years. Morty realized then that these fragments weren't just confessions, they were offerings. Rick was handing him pieces of himself, not to fix, but to witness, to keep them from vanishing into silence. And in that gentle exchange, Morty began to understand something new. Sometimes carrying another person's story was the greatest act of love. That night, Morty dreamed of stained glass, fragments scattered across a floor, each piece glowing faintly in the dark. When he bent to gather them, they didn't cut his hands, they warmed them. Slowly, the fragments came together, forming not a perfect window, but a mosaic of light. When Morty woke, he felt the flicker burning steadier than ever. Rick's past was heavy, but holding it didn't crush him. It filled him. In the morning light, Morty sat quietly at the breakfast table while Rick shuffled in, bleary-eyed. Their eyes met, and Morty didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The mosaic lived between them now, silent, fragile, enduring. For most of his life, Morty had been the listener. He was the one who stumbled behind Rick, nodding along, frightened, amazed, overwhelmed. He had grown used to silence, to letting Rick fill the air with brilliance and chaos. But as Rick's fragments of memory and regret spilled out into the nights, something inside Morty began to change. It was subtle at first, almost shy. When Rick paused between words, Morty would quietly say, "I get that," or "I know the feeling." Not as an answer, not as a solution, but as a soft offering. And every time he spoke, Rick would glance at him, sometimes surprised, sometimes wary, sometimes grateful in a way he didn't show on his face, but in the way his shoulders lowered. One afternoon, while rain tapped gently on the roof, Morty found himself speaking more than usual. They sat in the garage, the smell of old wires and oil filling the air. Rick was tinkering with a gadget, not really building anything, just moving his hands to distract his mind. Out of nowhere, Morty said, "You know, when I was younger, I used to pretend I was invisible." Rick froze, a tiny spark flickering from the tool in his hand. He glanced sideways. "Invisible? Why?" Morty swallowed, staring at the floor. "Because it felt easier. If no one saw me, then no one could be disappointed in me. I thought if I stayed small and quiet, people wouldn't notice when I messed up." The words hung heavy in the garage. Morty had never said that out loud before. Not to Rick, not to anyone. For a long time, Rick didn't move. Then he set the tool down, slowly, carefully. His voice was low, but it carried weight. "Morty, I've done a lot of things I regret. But I never wanted you to feel like you had to disappear." Morty's eyes stung. He shook his head. "I know, it wasn't your fault, it was just me, but I don't feel like that as much anymore. Not when I'm with you." Rick looked at him then, really looked, like he was seeing Morty not as the clumsy kid who followed him, but as someone with a voice of his own. For once, Rick didn't rush to respond. He just nodded, a slow, solemn nod, and returned to his work. Later that evening, Morty continued. They were sitting at the dinner table, Beth and Jerry half arguing in the kitchen, Summer scrolling through her phone. Morty pushed his food around his plate, then said quietly, "I used to think you were the only one who mattered, Rick. Like, if I kept up with you, then maybe I'd matter too. But now, I think maybe I'm allowed to matter just because I'm me." Rick's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He didn't speak. He didn't tease. He didn't pour another drink. He just set the fork down gently, as if the weight of Morty's words had landed in his own chest. From that night on, Morty's voice grew steadier. He began speaking small truths, sometimes about his fears, sometimes about moments that made him feel alive. He told Rick how he loved the sound of rain against the roof, how stars always reminded him of road trips with his mum, how sometimes he still dreamed of falling, but woke up feeling lighter. Rick listened, really listened. And though he never said so, Morty could feel the quiet respect in the way Rick leaned closer, in the way he stopped interrupting, in the way his answers softened. One night, Morty even dared to share a dream. "I keep seeing this place in my sleep," he told Rick. "It's like a field, but it goes on forever. And there's this tree in the middle, with roots that shine like glass. I sit under it, and it feels safe, like the world can't reach me there." Rick tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Sounds like a sanctuary." "Oh yeah," Morty whispered. "I think it is." Rick didn't mock the dream. He didn't dismiss it as childish. He simply nodded, eyes soft. "You hold on to that. Places like that, real or not, they keep you steady." And Morty realized with quiet wonder that Rick wasn't just listening, he was learning too. Morty's small truths, simple and unpolished, were finding a place in Rick's world. The shift was gentle, almost imperceptible, but real. Rick, who had always been the storm, was now pausing to hear the whispers of the boy beside him. And Morty, who once lived in silence, was finding a voice that carried not through volume, but through honesty. That night, as Morty lay in bed, he thought of his invisible self, the boy who hid in deep shadows so no one could see his mistakes. That boy still lingered in him, but he no longer felt alone. He was visible now in the softest, truest way, and the flicker in his chest burned a little brighter, fed by the simple truth that sometimes speaking even the smallest piece of your heart was enough to change everything. One morning, without warning or explanation, Rick tossed Morty a backpack and said, "Come on, we're going somewhere." Morty blinked, confused. He half expected to see the portal gun in Rick's other hand, but it wasn't there. Instead, Rick had a set of car keys dangling from his fingers, the old, rattling keys to a beat-up vehicle that hadn't left the driveway in months. "Wait, where are we going?" Morty asked, fumbling with the straps of the backpack. Rick shrugged, slipping on his coat. "Someplace quiet?" It wasn't an adventure in the usual sense. No green swirls, no strange planets, no danger waiting around the corner. Just the old car rumbling down back roads, fields stretching on either side, the sky pale and endless above them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was open, like a space carved out for breathing. Morty leaned against the window, watching sunlight flicker through the trees. Rick tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, humming faintly to a tune Morty didn't recognize. Eventually, they reached a lake. It wasn't remarkable, just a quiet body of water nestled between low hills, its surface rippling with the wind. Rick parked the car, turned off the engine, and stepped out without a word. Morty followed, the backpack slung awkwardly over his shoulder. They walked to the edge of the lake, where the ground was soft and cool. Rick lowered himself onto the grass with a grunt, stretching his legs out. Morty sat beside him, knees tucked in, staring at the water. The air smelled faintly of pine. Birds skimmed across the surface, their wings catching light. For a long time, they simply sat there. Morty wanted to ask why they had come, what made this place different from anywhere else. But something in Rick's stillness told him not to break the moment. Instead, he let the quiet seep in, the kind of quiet that softened the edges of thought. After a while, Rick sighed, leaning back on his hands. "You know, Morty, not everything has to be about building or fixing or running. Sometimes it's just about sitting, letting the world exist around you." Morty glanced at him, surprised by the softness in his tone. "Do you come here a lot?" Rick shook his head. Not really, but I used to find places like this, whenever the noise got too loud." He looked out across the water, his eyes distant. "Never stayed long enough, though. Always thought I had to keep moving, keep creating, keep proving." Morty's chest ached with something unspoken. He turned back to the lake, letting the ripples steady him. They unpacked the bag together. Inside was nothing fancy, 2 sandwiches wrapped in foil, a flask of water, and a small blanket. Rick grumbled something about keeping it simple as they spread the blanket across the grass. Morty unwrapped a sandwich and handed it to Rick. They ate in silence, the kind that feels like company rather than emptiness. As the afternoon stretched on, Morty found himself speaking without thinking. "You know, I like it here. It feels real, like nothing's trying too hard." Rick raised an eyebrow. "Real, huh?" "Yeah, like it doesn't need to be important. It just is. And that's enough." Rick let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You're starting to sound wiser than me, Morty. That's dangerous." Morty smiled faintly, brushing crumbs from his lap. "Maybe you're just finally listening." Rick smirked, but there was no bite to it, only warmth. As the sun began to sink lower, the sky shifting to shades of gold, Morty lay back on the blanket, staring upward. Clouds drifted lazily, and the world felt as though it were slowing with them. He closed his eyes, breathing deep, letting the flicker in his chest steady into a glow. Beside him, Rick lay down too, his hands folded over his stomach. For a while, Morty thought he had fallen asleep, but then Rick's voice broke the silence, low and thoughtful. "You know, Morty, if I'd found places like this sooner, maybe I wouldn't have lost so much." Morty opened his eyes, turning his head. Rick's face was shadowed by the fading light, but his expression was softer than Morty had ever seen it. "You didn't lose everything," Morty said quietly. "You still have this. You still have me." Rick didn't answer right away. He just closed his eyes, breathing out slow. When he finally spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "Yeah, I guess that's enough." The last of the sunlight painted the lake in fire before it slipped away. The world hushed into twilight, and for the first time in a long while, Rick and Morty rested, not in the chaos of travel, not in the clutter of the garage, but in the quiet gift of being still. When they finally drove home under a sky full of stars, Morty felt changed in a way he couldn't name. The flicker inside him burned steady, and he knew the memory of this day would stay with him forever. Not because it was loud or grand, but because it was simple, because it was theirs. When Morty woke the next morning, the memory of the lake clung to him like a soft dream. The rippling water, the golden sky, the silence that didn't press but embraced. It lingered in his chest, a quiet rhythm. For once, he didn't rush from bed. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the house. It was different now, not as sharp. The world outside was noisy, but inside he carried the hush of that afternoon. Downstairs, the house was as chaotic as ever. Beth's voice rose in sharp bursts as she debated with Jerry about something trivial. Summer clattered dishes in the kitchen, her music playing faintly from her phone. Usually, Morty would shrink beneath the noise, trying to move unseen. But today, the stillness from the lake whispered through him, reminding him that he could hold steady even here. He sat at the table with a bowl of cereal, spoon tapping gently against the edge. For once, he didn't feel like he had to fill the silence or escape it. He let the sounds swirl around him, but not through him. It was strange how something as small as sitting by a lake could follow him home like a shadow. Rick shuffled into the kitchen, hair wild, lab coat half-buttoned, a faint smell of metal and smoke clinging to him. He poured himself coffee without a word, but Morty caught the way his eyes flicked toward him, the briefest acknowledgement. They didn't need to speak. The stillness was still between them, as though they'd carried it back in their pockets. Later, in the garage, Rick tinkered at his workbench. Normally, Morty would hover nervously, waiting for instructions, but instead he simply sat on a stool, watching without the usual pressure to keep up. After a while, he pulled out a notebook from the bench drawer and began to sketch the lake, the blanket, the tree line. His drawings were clumsy, his lines uneven, but they made him smile. Rick glanced over. "What's that supposed to be? Modern art?" Morty flushed, holding the notebook closer. "It's just the lake. You know, from yesterday." Rick grunted, but his voice was softer than usual. Not bad, Morty, not bad at all." Morty felt the warmth of the words more than he expected. It wasn't praise exactly, but it was something close, and in Rick's voice, it felt like enough. That night, Morty dreamed of the lake again. Only this time he wasn't sitting under the tree alone. Rick was there too, and so was Summer and Beth and even Jerry. They weren't arguing or running or trying to fix anything. They were just there, sitting together in the glow of the setting sun. It wasn't perfect. It was still messy, still awkward. but it was theirs. When Morty woke, he realized the dream wasn't about the lake itself. It was about what the lake had given him. A piece of stillness he could carry, a reminder that peace didn't always have to be far away. It could exist right here, in the middle of noise and imperfection. Throughout the week, he practiced holding on to that echo. When Summer complained, he listened without letting frustration take root. When Jerry fumbled over his words, Morty found himself answering with patience instead of irritation. Even when Rick muttered darkly about things Morty couldn't quite understand, Morty simply stayed beside him, present, steady. The flicker inside him felt different now, less fragile. It pulsed in rhythm with the quietness he carried, like a heartbeat reminding him that he was enough, even in stillness, even in silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Morty wandered outside to the backyard. The air was warm, the sky painted in fading colors. He lay in the grass, staring up, letting the stillness of the lake return to him. Rick appeared at the doorway after a while, holding a mug of something Morty couldn't see. He didn't step outside, just leaned against the frame, watching. After a long pause, he said, "You're changing, Morty." "I can see it." Morty tilted his head, squinting. "Changing how?" Rick shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. "Used to be, you were all nerves and noise. Now you're calmer. Like maybe you finally figured out you don't have to chase the world to matter in it." Morty blinked, taken aback by the honesty. "You really think so?" Rick raised his mug in a small toast. "Yeah, and don't let me screw it up for you." For once, Morty didn't laugh nervously or shrug the words away. He simply nodded, the flicker in his chest glowing brighter. The lake had been simple, a quiet trip, a blanket, a sandwich, a sky full of clouds. Yet it had planted something lasting inside Morty, something he would carry no matter where he went. Stillness wasn't about where you sat, it was about what you allowed yourself to keep. And Morty kept it close, like a secret, like a lullaby. Summer wasn't the type to sit still. Her room was always humming with music, her fingers always scrolling through glowing screens, her words tumbling out in quick bursts that rarely waited for answers. Morty had grown used to it, the way her energy seemed like a constant storm he could never quite keep up with. But lately, something inside him had shifted, and he began to notice the spaces between her storms, the little pauses, the breaths she didn't think anyone saw. It happened one afternoon in the living room. Summer sprawled across the couch, phone in hand, feet tapping restlessly against the cushions. Morty sat in the armchair nearby, holding a notebook filled with his sketches. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched, listening to the sound of her music leaking softly from her earbuds, the rhythm of her tapping feet. She noticed his gaze. "What? You're staring like a creep." Morty flushed, looking down at the notebook. "Nah, I was just, I don't know, you seem kinda restless." Summer rolled her eyes. "Wow, thanks, Sherlock. That's my default setting." She went back to scrolling, but her tapping slowed just a little. Morty hesitated. "You ever feel like you're always running, but not really getting anywhere?" That caught her off guard. She pulled one earbud out and gave him a sidelong glance. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged, flipping the page in his notebook. I don't know. I used to feel like that all the time. Like everything was too loud, too fast. Like if I didn't keep moving, I'd just get swallowed up." Summer sat up, frowning. "And now you don't?" Morty shook his head. "Not so much. I found this place with Rick, a lake. And it was just quiet, not boring quiet, like safe quiet. I didn't know how much I needed that until it happened. Summer studied him, suspicion in her eyes, but curiosity too. You, safe quiet, since when do you get poetic about lakes? Morty chuckled softly. Since I sat there and realized maybe I don't have to run all the time. Maybe it's okay to just be still. The words hung in the air. For a moment, Summer didn't reply. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, I wouldn't even know how to do that. Morty looked at her then, really looked. Beneath the sarcasm, beneath the restless tapping, he saw the same flicker he'd carried for so long. The need to be enough, to be noticed, to belong. He understood her more than she knew. You could try, he said gently. I mean, you don't have to go to some lake. You can just sit, listen, let it be quiet even for a minute. Summer snorted, but there wasn't much force in it. And what? Suddenly my life is fixed. Morty, come on. Not fixed, he replied softly. Just lighter for a little while. Something in his tone made her pause. She set her phone down on the couch cushion and leaned back, arms folded. All right, 1 minute, but if I get bored, I'm blaming you. Morty smiled faintly. Deal. And so they sat. At first, Summer fidgeted, shifting positions, sighing loudly, but after a while her movements slowed. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the distant chirp of birds outside the window, these small sounds filled the space where words used to be. Morty didn't push. He just let the quiet unfold around them. Summer closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Weird, she murmured. What is? It's not bad. She almost looked surprised at her own admission. I thought it would be, like, suffocating. But it's kinda... okay. Morty's chest warmed. Yeah, that's what I thought too, but then it starts to feel like the world's holding you instead of chasing you. She glanced at him, brow furrowed. Since when did you get all wise? He laughed softly. Don't tell Rick. He'll say I'm getting sentimental. Summer smirked, but there was softness in her eyes. For once, she didn't grab her phone again right away. She leaned back into the cushions, exhaling slowly. Maybe you're onto something, little brother. The moment wasn't grand, no sudden revelations, no dramatic change. But it was real. Morty saw it in the way her shoulders eased, the way her tapping foot finally went still. He realized then that stillness wasn't just something you kept for yourself. It could ripple outward, touching the people closest to you, softening their storms. That night, Morty thought about the lake again, not the water or the blanket or even the sunset, but the way it had planted something inside him that could now be shared. He wondered if that was what Rick had always known, that some discoveries weren't about science or inventions, but about carrying quietness into places that needed it most. And as Morty drifted towards sleep, he felt the flicker in his chest pulsed gently, not just for himself, but for Summer too. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart. And that, he thought, was enough. The garage had always been Rick's kingdom, cluttered with wires and scraps of old machines, the smell of metal and oil lingering in the air. To Morty, it had once felt like a maze of noise, a place where the hum of half-finished inventions pressed down on him until he could hardly breathe. But tonight, stepping into that space again, it felt different. Not quieter exactly, but less heavy, as if his heart no longer braced against every spark, every tool tossed aside. Rick was hunched over the workbench, goggles on, muttering under his breath. A trail of smoke curled from something that looked like both a toaster and a telescope. He cursed under his breath, twisting a wrench that didn't quite fit. Morty leaned against the doorway, watching. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like an intruder here. He felt steady, "You're going to strip the bolt," Morty said softly. Rick looked up sharply, eyes narrowed. "Excuse me? Since when are you the engineering authority?" Morty shrugged, walking closer. "Since I noticed you're forcing it." "That's not how it fits." Rick blinked, then looked back at the bolt. His hand stilled. With a grunt, he set the wrench down and tried again, more carefully this time. The piece slid into place with a soft click. "Huh," Rick muttered. "Lucky guess." Morty smiled faintly. "Sure, lucky." For a while they stood in silence. Rick adjusted a few more wires, his movements precise, though slower than usual. Morty perched on a stool nearby, notebook in his lap. He wasn't sketching this time, just holding it, like a small anchor. "You know," Rick said at last, not looking up, "you've been different lately." Morty tilted his head. "Different how?" Rick waved a hand vaguely, as if swatting at smoke. "Not whining every 5 seconds, not panicking when something sparks. You're calmer, which, is weird for you." Morty chuckled softly. "Yeah. I guess I don't feel like I have to fight the noise anymore. It's still there, but it doesn't get inside me like it used to." Rick paused. His hands, usually restless, went still. He stared at the device on the bench as if it suddenly meant less than the words drifting between them. "You found something I couldn't give you, didn't you?" Morty didn't answer right away. He thought of the lake, of summer sitting still for the first time, of the flicker in his chest that had grown warmer with every quiet moment. Finally he said, "Maybe I just found a way to listen to myself, to let it be enough." Rick's jaw tightened, and for once there was no joke, no sarcasm waiting on his tongue. He looked older under the dim garage light, shadows catching the lines on his face. "I tried to give you everything," he said quietly. "The universe, adventure, knowledge, and what you needed was none of that." Morty leaned forward, his voice gentle. "I still needed you, Rick. That hasn't changed, but maybe I don't need the universe to prove it. Just this. Just us." Rick let out a low, shaky laugh. "You're turning into the stable one. That's terrifying." Morty smiled. "Guess someone's got to balance things out." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, like the pause between heartbeats. Rick adjusted his goggles, pretending to study the wires again, but Morty could see the way his shoulders softened just slightly. After a while, Morty spoke again. "You know, it doesn't all have to be fixed tonight. You don't have to finish it. Whatever that is." Rick glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "Since when do I take breaks?" "Since now," Morty said softly. "Because you look tired, and maybe it's okay to just stop for a bit." Rick opened his mouth to argue, then shut it again. His hand hovered over the tools, then dropped to his side. He sighed, long and low, and for once didn't fight the suggestion. "You're really not the same kid anymore," Rick murmured. Morty smiled again, the flicker in his chest steady as a lantern. "Guess we both aren't." Rick pulled off his goggles and set them on the bench. The garage light buzzed faintly above them, casting a warm glow over the mess of wires and metal. Morty thought it looked less like a battlefield and more like a campfire now, messy, imperfect, but still glowing. For the first time, Morty didn't feel like he was following Rick into chaos. He felt like he was standing beside him, both of them caught in the same stillness. And in that moment, Morty realized something simple and profound. The steadiness he carried wasn't just for himself. It was for Rick too. He didn't always understand Rick's words, but he understood his heart. And sometimes that was enough to light the whole garage. Morty had always thought of his parents' house as a place of noise, arguments echoing down the hall, television laughter filling the living room, the clatter of plates at dinner. The noise never stopped, not really. And yet, in the middle of all of it, Morty began to notice something else, a quiet that lived underneath, a thread that bound Beth and Jerry together, even when it seemed like they couldn't agree on anything at all. It started one evening when he wandered into the kitchen. The light above the sink was dim, humming faintly, and Beth was sitting at the table with a glass of water. Jerry stood at the counter, trying and failing to fix the coffee maker. Morty almost turned away, expecting the usual bickering, but instead he saw Beth's hand resting near Jerry's, not touching, not pulling away either. "Jerry," she said, her voice soft in a way Morty rarely heard. "You don't have to fix it tonight." Jerry looked up, startled. His face carried that familiar mix of doubt and eagerness to please, but he set the screwdriver down. "I just thought I could help." Beth smiled faintly. It wasn't a smile Morty saw often, more tired, more real. "You already do." Morty froze in the doorway. He wasn't sure if they even noticed him there, but the moment felt too delicate to disturb. For once there was no argument, no clashing noise. Just two people, imperfect and worn, holding on to something unseen. Later that night, Morty lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He thought about how he had always judged them, how he'd rolled his eyes at Jerry's clumsy attempts to be useful, or at Beth's sharp words that cut too deep. But now he wondered if all of it, every flaw, every misstep, was just their strange way of loving each other. The next day, Morty found himself watching them again. Jerry was in the yard, fumbling with the hose, and Beth was nearby trimming the garden. They weren't talking, not really, but they weren't fighting either. And in the pauses, Morty noticed small things. The way Beth took the clippers from Jerry when he struggled, without mocking him. The way Jerry, absent-minded as ever, shifted the hose so the spray of water wouldn't catch her shoes. Little gestures, invisible unless you were looking closely. Morty thought about the flicker inside his chest. How it had grown steadier, how it had begun to spread into the world around him. Maybe this was part of it, learning to see what had always been there, hidden under layers of noise. That night at dinner, Jerry spilled sauce on the table. Beth sighed, but instead of snapping, she reached over and dabbed it with a napkin. Morty caught her eyes for a moment. She looked tired, but softer than usual. And Morty realized she loved him, she loved Jerry, in a way that wasn't perfect, wasn't neat, but was still real. "Mom," Morty said quietly, surprising himself, "do you ever, I don't know, feel like you and Dad are meant to be together?" Beth paused, spoon in hand. Jerry looked up too, eyes wide. For a moment Morty regretted asking, but Beth set the spoon down and looked at him, really looked. "Morty," she said gently, "meant to be isn't about perfection. It's about choosing, over and over, even when it's hard." Jerry swallowed, as if those words meant more to him than he could say. Morty nodded slowly. He didn't need more explanation. He could feel it, the quiet thread beneath the noise, the way love lived in gestures so small they almost disappeared. He thought of the lake, of the sketches, of summer learning to breathe. It was all connected somehow, woven into the same tapestry. Later, when Morty went to bed, he heard his parents talking softly downstairs, not arguing, just talking. Their voices rose and fell like two notes in a lullaby. He didn't catch the words, but he didn't need to. The sound was enough. For the first time in years, Morty didn't fall asleep bracing himself for the next fight. He fell asleep listening to that quiet, steady rhythm, the proof that even in their flaws, Beth and Jerry carried a kind of love that had always been there, and Morty kept that with him, another small lantern added to the collection of lights inside his chest. Because he was beginning to understand, the universe didn't need to hand him grand adventures or flawless answers. Sometimes it simply asked him to notice the quiet that had been there all along. Rick had always filled the world with noise, machines humming, sparks crackling, muttered curses, the hiss of bottles being opened and drained. To Morty, his grandfather had once seemed like a storm that never stopped, like a force of nature that demanded constant motion. But slowly Morty began to notice what hid underneath. It wasn't just invention, it wasn't just genius, it was loneliness. One night, Morty found Rick sitting in the garage long after the tools had gone quiet. The light above the bench flickered faintly, throwing soft shadows over his face. He wasn't working on anything, not really. His hands rested on the table, empty, as if even they had grown tired. "Rick?" Morty asked, his voice hushed, careful not to break the stillness. Rick didn't look up at first. When he finally did, his eyes looked distant, red-rimmed, like he'd been staring at something far away. "Can't sleep," he muttered. Morty sat down across from him. "What's keeping you up?" Rick gave a hollow laugh. "Kid, if I knew how to answer that, I wouldn't be here." They sat together in silence. Morty expected Rick to pour himself another drink, to bury the moment under sarcasm. But instead, Rick just sat. His shoulders slumped, his hands trembling faintly. The storm had gone quiet. And Morty saw it then. The truth he had always missed. Rick wasn't just restless because of brilliance, he was restless because silence scared him. The quiet left him alone with himself, with memories he couldn't drink away, with regrets he couldn't unmake. "Do you ever feel like the machines are just noise?" Morty asked softly. "Like they keep you from hearing what's inside?" Rick's head tilted slightly as though Morty had spoken in a language he hadn't heard in years. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than Morty had ever heard it. "Every day, Morty, every single day." The words hung in the air, heavier than any invention, more fragile than any equation. Morty felt his chest tighten, but not with fear, with compassion. "You don't have to fill the silence, Rick," Morty whispered. "It's okay to just be." Rick gave a shaky breath, almost a laugh, almost a sob. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not easy," Morty said gently. "But maybe it doesn't have to be impossible either." Rick leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For a long time, he didn't move. Then almost reluctantly, he said, "You know, your grandma used to hum when the house got too quiet. Drove me crazy as a kid, thought it was pointless. But now, I think she was onto something." Morty smiled faintly. "What did she hum?" Rick shook his head. "Some old lullaby. I can't remember the words. Just the sound. Software like it kept the dark from getting too loud." They both sat still, letting the memory float between them. Morty could almost hear it, the faint hum of a woman's voice filling a quiet house. He thought about how Rick had built machines to drown out silence, when all along, maybe what he needed was just a lullaby. Morty closed his eyes and, without thinking, began humming softly. Not any song he knew, just a tune that rose and fell like water against the shore. Rick's eyes widened slightly, his lips parting, but he didn't stop him. He just listened. The garage, cluttered and dim, felt different in that moment. Not a workshop, not a storm, just a place where two people sat together, letting sound soften the silence. When Morty finished, the quiet returned, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It felt peaceful. Rick leaned forward, elbows on the table, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "You're not supposed to take care of me, Morty." "That's not how this works." Morty shook his head. "Maybe it's not about supposed to. Maybe it's just about being here, for each other." Rick stared at him for a long moment, then looked away, blinking quickly. "You're getting too wise for your own good." Morty smiled softly. "Or maybe I'm just listening better." Rick let out a sigh, half exasperation, half relief. He picked up a screwdriver, turned it over in his hands, then set it back down. For once he didn't force himself into motion. He let the stillness stay. And in that fragile silence, Morty saw the truth more clearly than ever. His grandfather wasn't invincible. He wasn't a storm. He was a man who had been running from silence his whole life. But he didn't have to run tonight. Not with Morty sitting there, keeping the quiet company. And maybe that was enough. That night, after the garage had gone dark and Rick had finally let himself rest, Morty drifted into sleep more deeply than he had in a long time. It wasn't the kind of sleep filled with restless, scattered images. It was slower, softer, like stepping into a gentle current that carried him somewhere he almost recognized. In the dream, Morty stood in a field of tall grass, each blade glowing faintly like threads of light. The air was calm, carrying the smell of rain, though no clouds were overhead. He looked down at his hands and found a lantern, resting there, warm and steady, its flame quiet but unwavering. When he lifted his head, he saw more lanterns stretching into the distance, a path winding through the field. Each one flickered with a glow that seemed familiar, shapes of memories shimmering inside their glass. The first lantern showed Summer at the lake, standing tall with sunlight catching in her hair, her breath steady, her hand brushing the water as if it belonged to her. The next lantern held Beth and Jerry at the kitchen table, their hands resting near each other, not touching, but close enough to matter. Another lantern shimmered with Rick's weary face, softened by the quiet as Morty hummed a lullaby. Morty's chest swelled as he moved forward, each step lighting another memory. None of them were grand or explosive. They weren't adventures that bent the universe. They were small, fragile things, kindnesses, moments of stillness, tiny pieces of love that had somehow held their lives together. As Morty walked, he realized the lanterns weren't guiding him to a single destination. They were showing him what had been there all along. Each light belonged not just to the people he loved, but to himself too. His flicker, his quiet heart. The path curved toward a grove of trees. Their branches arched above him like a cathedral, and in the clearing at the center stood a single, enormous lantern. Its glow was softer than the others, almost like moonlight pressed into glass. Morty stepped closer, drawn by a pull that wasn't urgent but deeply familiar, like a lullaby hummed long ago. Inside this lantern, he didn't see one memory. He saw all of them layered together, the laughter, the tears, the quiet gestures, the awkward moments of love. They wove into a tapestry that shimmered, alive and whole. Morty reached out, his fingers brushing the glass. Warmth spread through him, not as a rush, but as a slow, steady glow. For the first time, he felt the flicker inside him pulse in rhythm with the lantern's light. He wasn't just holding on to pieces of other people, he was part of the lantern itself. A voice rose in the grove then. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear. It was more like the hum of Beth's forgotten lullaby, or the faint rhythm of Rick's breathing when he finally let himself rest. A sound without words, but filled with meaning. The voice seemed to say, "You are not alone. You never were. Every quiet moment you've carried was always leading here." Morty closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. His body softened, the tension draining from his shoulders. The field, the lanterns, the trees, all of it blurred into a calm, dreamlike haze. He thought of the people he loved, and he thought of himself, and for once he didn't feel like he had to chase or fix or prove anything. He just belonged. When Morty opened his eyes, he was back in his bed. The ceiling above him was dark, but the flicker inside his chest still glowed. He could feel it steady and warm, as if the dream hadn't ended but had only settled into him more deeply. The house was quiet. Not the heavy quiet that Rick feared, not the brittle quiet before an argument. It was a soft quiet, like the world was breathing slow and gentle, holding him in its rhythm. Morty turned on his side, pulling the blanket closer. His thoughts were calm, not racing, not loud, just calm. And as he closed his eyes again, he felt as though somewhere, in some dream space between waking and sleep, the lantern path still stretched before him, waiting, glowing, patient. Morty smiled faintly. He knew he could walk it again whenever he needed to, because the lanterns weren't just in the dream, they were in the life he lived, in the people he loved, in the quiet that no longer felt so empty. And with that thought, Morty let himself drift further, carried on the soft current of sleep. The path would be there tomorrow. Time had always frightened Morty. Not in the way people feared monsters or dark alleys, but in a quieter, lonelier way. He had always felt like time was rushing past him, tugging him forward before he was ready, whispering reminders of all the things he hadn't done yet. Every day seemed too short, every moment too fragile. But something began to shift after the lantern dream. When Morty woke the next morning, the air in the house felt different. The clock on the wall ticked the same as always, but the sound wasn't sharp anymore. It was steady, gentle, like footsteps keeping him company instead of chasing him down. He sat at the kitchen table with a piece of toast, the butter melting slowly across the surface. Normally he would have eaten quickly, already restless, already worried about the next thing, but this time he just watched the butter pool and soften. He lifted the toast to his mouth, took a bite, and let himself taste it fully. It was such a small thing, almost nothing at all. Yet Morty felt like he was learning a new language. Rick shuffled into the room, yawning, a mug clutched in his hand. His hair was a storm, his eyes half closed. Normally, Morty would have felt awkward under the silence. But today, the quiet felt like a blanket around them both. They didn't need to fill it. "Morning," Morty said softly. Rick grunted, poured himself coffee and sat down. No sarcasm, no complaints, just two people existing in the same rhythm, neither one rushing the other. Morty realized then that time wasn't an enemy, it wasn't chasing him, it was walking with him side by side, patient and unhurried. Later that day, Morty sat outside in the yard watching the clouds. They drifted in slow shapes, stretching and folding like blankets being shaken out across the sky. He lay back in the grass, the earth cool against his skin, and let the minutes drift past. For once he didn't count them. He didn't feel the need. The world seemed to hum with the same rhythm he had felt in the dream, the same steady flicker of the lanterns. Every breath, every sound of wind in the branches, every small beat of his heart, it was all part of the same slow song. Rick wandered out after a while, standing over him with a puzzled frown. "You just gonna lie there all day?" Morty tilted his head, smiling faintly. "Yeah. Maybe." Rick shook his head but didn't argue. Instead, he sat down beside him with a sigh, pulling a flask from his coat. For a long time, they both just watched the sky. Morty noticed Rick's breathing slow, his shoulders unclench. Even Rick, for all his storms, was letting time move softer. It felt like a gift, a small miracle. That night, Morty lay awake, not restless but thoughtful. He thought about how many times he had wished for more time, how many times he had feared it was slipping away. But now he wondered if time hadn't been the problem at all. Maybe it was how he had been holding it, too tightly, too fearfully, always measuring it instead of living in it. Now it felt different. Time wasn't rushing ahead or dragging him along. It was simply beside him, walking at his pace, waiting when he needed to pause. Morty whispered to the dark, as though speaking to the dream lanterns themselves. "Thanks for slowing down with me." The room answered only with stillness, but Morty felt it anyway. That quiet companionship, the rhythm of time breathing beside him. And with that comfort, he drifted into sleep once more, the seconds stretching like soft threads, weaving him into a dream he didn't need to chase. For the first time in a long while, Morty no longer feared the ticking of the clock. It sounded, instead, like a lullaby. Morty hadn't thought about his childhood in a long time. Not really. The memories were always there, scattered like pebbles across the path of his life, but he had mostly walked past them without looking too closely. They had felt awkward, heavy, sometimes embarrassing. Things he wished he could forget. But after the lantern dream, after the feeling that time was walking beside him instead of dragging him forward, Morty found himself glancing back more often. And what surprised him most was how different those old moments looked now, less like scars, more like little sparks that had been waiting patiently for him to notice. One afternoon, Morty wandered into the garage while Rick tinkered with something quiet, the smell of solder hanging in the air. Morty picked up an old box tucked in the corner, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were a few toys, a notebook with doodles in the margins, and a broken wristwatch he had once thought was the coolest thing in the world. He held the watch in his palm, its cracked glass catching the light. He remembered the day he had worn it proudly to school, only for someone to laugh at him. He had gone home that night, cheeks burning with shame, and stuffed the watch away. For years that memory had hurt, as if it proved how small and clumsy he was. But now, looking at the watch, Morty felt something different. He saw a younger version of himself who had simply wanted to carry a little magic on his wrist to believe in something bright. And instead of cringing, Morty smiled. That boy hadn't been foolish, he had been hopeful. Rick glanced over from his workbench. "What's got you smiling like an idiot?" Morty shrugged. "Just remembering. But it doesn't feel bad anymore." Rick grunted, but there was no bite to it. Guess that's progress." That night Morty dreamed again, not of lanterns this time, but of himself as a small boy. He saw the younger Morty sitting on the floor, surrounded by crayons, drawing crooked stars on scrap paper. The boy looked up, wide-eyed, as if surprised to see his older self standing there. "You kept going," the boy whispered. Morty knelt down, smiling softly. "Yeah, I guess I did." They didn't say much more. They didn't need to. The dream faded like mist, leaving Morty with a warmth he carried into waking. In the days that followed, other memories surfaced. He remembered tripping during a school play, the sound of laughter echoing in his ears. For years that moment had haunted him. But now, thinking back, he realized that after the fall, a friend had reached down and helped him up. He remembered their smile, the kindness in their eyes. The fall wasn't the whole story. The hand reaching for him was too. He remembered nights when he had cried quietly in his room, thinking no one cared. But as he looked back now, he realized that Rick had often appeared the next morning, gruff and awkward, pushing a plate of food toward him without comment. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't warm in the way he had wanted, but it was love in its own strange shape. even if he hadn't known how to see it then. With softer eyes, Morty found that his past wasn't as jagged as he thought. The sharp edges were still there, but they were softened by all the small kindnesses, the overlooked details that had always been present. One evening, Morty sat by the window, the night air drifting in, carrying the scent of rain. He thought about how hard he had been on himself, how much he had wished to be someone else, someone better, someone braver. And he realized quietly that every version of himself had been doing the best he could. Even the awkward boy with the cracked wristwatch, even the Morty who stumbled and blushed and didn't always know what to say. He whispered to the night, "Thank you for being me, even when I didn't like it." The words were small, but they felt like a release, like setting down a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. Rick passed by the doorway just then, muttering something about the leaky faucet. He glanced at Morty, who was staring out at the rain, and for once didn't interrupt with a joke or a jab. Instead, Rick paused, nodded faintly, and walked on. Morty smiled to himself. Even without words, he felt understood. And when he finally curled into bed, the memories no longer crowded him with regret. They felt like lanterns, too, scattered along the path of his life, glowing quietly, forgiving him for how long it had taken to see their light. With that thought, Morty drifted into sleep, his breath slow and easy. The boy he had been walked beside him now, no longer hidden in shadow. Time, memory, and self, all walking together, softly, patiently. Rick never liked to look back. The past for him was a box, left shut, nailed down and hidden beneath 1,000 layers of work. Whenever something tried to pry it open, an old face, a familiar smell, a song from long ago, he drowned it in noise, in inventions, in muttered curses, in the bottom of a bottle. Anything to keep from remembering. But Morty's newfound stillness, his quiet way of looking at things, began to seep into Rick's world too. He didn't admit it out loud, not even to himself, but when Morty sat watching the sky or smiled at some memory of childhood, Rick found himself pausing. And when he paused, he found himself listening. And when he listened, the box rattled. It began one night when Rick couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, Morty's breathing soft down the hall, but Rick's mind buzzed with restless static. He wandered into the garage, meaning to distract himself with wires and screws, but instead he found his hand drifting toward a shelf he hadn't touched in years. There was an old box there, dust gathered thick across the lid. Rick hesitated, muttering under his breath, then tugged it open. Inside were fragments of a life he rarely allowed himself to remember. A small photograph bent at the corners, a lighter with faded paint, a tangle of keys that no longer opened anything. Rick picked up the photograph. The image was faint, blurred by time, but he could still make out faces, his own, younger, his eyes a little softer, and beside him, someone who had once mattered more than anything. He stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling slightly. The garage was silent, except for the faint hum of a machine in the corner. For once, Rick didn't try to fill the silence. He just sat there with the photograph, and in the quiet, he felt the ache of things long gone. When he finally put the picture back, his chest felt heavier and lighter all at once. He didn't know what to call the feeling. He didn't want to call it anything. The next morning, Morty noticed Rick seemed distant. Not grumpy, not sharp, just far away, as if his thoughts had wandered somewhere he didn't usually let them go. Morty didn't ask. He just sat at the table, eating cereal, and let the silence stretch comfortably. Rick was grateful for that. Later, Morty went into the yard and Rick found himself watching from the doorway. Morty was tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick, humming quietly to himself. The sound tugged at something in Rick's chest. He remembered another voice, long ago, humming in the same absent-minded way, while tinkering in the kitchen, while folding laundry, while watching him work. Rick closed his eyes. He hadn't let himself think of her in years. The memory hurt, sharp and tender all at once, but this time he didn't shove it away. He let it sit with him, just for a moment. That evening, Morty looked up from the couch and found Rick staring into the middle distance, lost in thought. "You okay, Rick?" he asked gently. Rick blinked, rubbed a hand over his face and muttered, "Yeah, kid. Just ghosts." Morty didn't push. He just nodded. "They don't have to be scary, you know." Rick gave a half snort, half laugh. "Yeah, well, mine usually are." But something in Morty's calmness stayed with him. That night, Rick dreamed, not the chaotic, jumbled dreams he usually had, but something quieter. He dreamed of sitting at a table, his younger self bent over blueprints, and someone placing a cup of coffee beside him, warm steam curling in the air. He didn't see her face, but he felt the warmth of her presence. For the first time in years, he didn't wake up angry. Instead, he woke with his throat tight, his chest aching in a way that wasn't entirely bad. Over the next days, Rick caught himself remembering more. Small things, a laugh that once filled a room, the smell of burnt toast in the mornings, a song that used to play on the radio when drives stretched long and quiet. He realized how much he had buried, how many details he had shoved away because they hurt too much. But now, thanks to Morty's gentleness, Rick began to see that even the painful memories carried light. Even shadows meant there had once been something bright. One night, as they sat outside watching the stars, Morty asked quietly, "Do you ever think about when you were younger?" Rick hesitated. Normally, he would have brushed it off. But the stars were soft overhead, Morty's presence calm beside him, and the question didn't feel like a trap. "Sometimes," Rick admitted. His voice was rough, low. "Not often. Too much there I'd rather not see." Morty didn't argue. He just said, "Maybe if you look with kinder eyes, it won't hurt as much." Rick stared at him, surprised at the wisdom in his tone. Then he looked back at the stars. "Maybe," he murmured. For a long while they said nothing more. The night stretched wide and peaceful around them. Rick felt the memories pressing close, not as enemies this time, but as old companions he hadn't greeted in years. And for the first time, he thought maybe Morty was right. Maybe he could learn to look back, not to punish himself, but to remember that once, long ago, he had known love. The silence lingered, gentle as the dark sky above, and in that stillness Rick breathed a little easier. By now Morty had grown used to the new rhythm of his days. Things felt softer, less hurried. Even Rick, in his own strange way, seemed touched by that stillness. There were still outbursts, still grumbles and sharp edges, but between them were longer pauses, moments where silence carried more meaning than words. It was in those pauses that Morty began to notice something. Whenever he slowed down enough to simply be present, whether watching the clouds, listening to the quiet tick of the clock, or just breathing alongside the night, Rick seemed to slow too. Almost as if Morty's stillness gave him permission to rest. Almost as if together they had begun carrying a lantern neither one could hold alone. One evening, the air was cool and heavy with the smell of rain. The storm had passed, leaving puddles in the yard that mirrored the clouds. Morty stepped outside barefoot, letting the damp grass press between his toes. He looked at the puddles, at the sky reflected in each one, and felt an odd sense of wonder, like the heavens had been scattered on the ground for him to walk among. Rick joined him a few minutes later, hands shoved in his coat pockets. He muttered something about damp shoes, but didn't turn back inside. Instead, he stood beside Morty, looking down at the reflections. The silence stretched between them, soft and steady. "They look like little portals," Morty said quietly. Rick glanced at him, then back at the puddles. "Yeah, just ones you can't step through." Morty crouched, dipping his fingers into the water. Ripples bent the reflection of the clouds, twisting them into new shapes. "Maybe that's the point," he murmured. "Not every portal takes you somewhere else. Some just show you where you already are." Rick huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "Kid, you say stuff sometimes." He trailed off, but Morty thought he caught a flicker of warmth in his eyes. They wandered the yard slowly, neither of them rushing. Morty felt a strange comfort in their shared silence, in the way their footsteps matched without trying. It was as if their bond had become something alive, breathing with them, guiding them gently forward. Later, as they sat inside by the faint glow of a lamp, Morty leaned back against the couch and asked, "Do you think maybe we've been carrying the same lantern all along?" Rick frowned. "What lantern?" "You know," Morty said softly, hesitant but sure. "The thing that keeps us going, the light we both see even when everything feels dark. Maybe it's not just yours or mine. Maybe it's both." Rick looked at him for a long time, eyes narrowed as if he wanted to argue. But the words didn't come. Instead, he exhaled slowly and sank deeper into his chair. "Maybe," he admitted at last, almost too low to hear. The quiet that followed was warm, unbroken. Morty let his eyes drift closed, feeling the comfort of Rick's presence close by. For so long he had feared being small, being lost, being left behind. But now, with this invisible lantern between them, he no longer felt alone. In the days that followed, Morty began noticing it everywhere. When Rick adjusted his inventions just slightly slower, letting Morty follow along. When Morty sat at the table sketching shapes and Rick, without a word, set a cup of tea beside him. When they both stood watching the stars, neither needing to fill the night with explanations. It was as though the lantern had grown, a shared rhythm guiding them both. Not a bright flame, not a dazzling beacon, just a steady, quiet glow. Enough to see by, enough to rest in. One night, Morty dreamed of the lanterns again. Only this time, there weren't countless rows stretching into forever. There was just one, bright, steady, cradled in both his hands and Rick's. They held it together, their shadows overlapping, their breaths rising and falling in the same slow pattern. When Morty woke, he felt no rush to leave the dream. He carried it with him instead, like warmth lingering from a blanket long after it's been set aside. And in that warmth, he realized something simple but true. Whatever paths they had walked, however broken or wandering, Rick and Morty were lantern bearers now. Not just for themselves, but for each other. The light they carried was enough. The quiet bond between them, unspoken but alive, was enough. Time had always moved like a restless current around Morty. Fast, uneven, sometimes dragging him under, sometimes tossing him forward without asking. But lately, it had slowed. Not because the days themselves had changed, but because Morty had. He no longer clung to the clock, no longer measured himself by what he had done or hadn't done. Instead, he watched, breathed, and let things come to him like driftwood, washing gently ashore. And in that stillness, he began to wonder about the light he and Rick carried together, the lantern that seemed to pass quietly between them with every shared silence. He wondered if it might last beyond them. not as a flame others could see, but as a presence woven into the air, waiting for someone else to notice. One evening, Morty sat at the kitchen table, doodling absent shapes on a scrap of paper. Rick was nearby, fiddling with a broken piece of machinery. The hum of tools filled the silence, steady and rhythmic. "Rick," Morty said after a long pause. Rick grunted without looking up. "Do you ever think about what you'll leave behind? Not inventions or anything, just you. The you that people remember." Rick set the tool down, leaning back in his chair. His eyes flickered with annoyance, but underneath was something softer, something tired. "That's a dangerous road, Morty. Start thinking about that stuff, and next thing you know, you're writing sappy letters to people who stopped listening years ago." Morty smiled faintly. "Maybe, but don't you think it matters? Not what they remember exactly, but how it feels, like the little things. The tea you made, or the times you showed up without saying why. I think those are what stick." Rick stared at him for a long moment, then turned back to his work. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "If anything sticks, Morty, it's because you were the one paying attention." The words landed heavier than Morty expected. He thought about how easy it would have been to miss the small acts, to overlook the quiet ways Rick had cared. And he realized maybe legacy wasn't about being remembered by everyone. Maybe it was about being seen fully, even if only by one person. Later that night, Morty lay in bed, the window cracked open. The air smelled of wet earth, the echo of a passing storm. He closed his eyes and imagined the lantern again, glowing between him and Rick. But this time, the light stretched further, spilling outward like ripples in water. He saw faces, some familiar, some he couldn't quite place, bathed in that quiet glow. It wasn't about fame, or stories, or names etched into stone. It was about the way the light traveled, passed gently from one heart to another. Morty thought of his younger self, clutching the broken wristwatch, desperate for something magical. He thought of Rick's weary eyes, hiding more kindness than he let himself admit. And he thought of all the people who would never know those moments, yet who might still feel their warmth somehow, like the lingering glow of a lantern carried down a long, winding road. The next morning, Morty found himself outside again, watching the sunrise. Rick shuffled out, coffee in hand, muttering about the chill. Morty glanced at him, then back at the horizon. "You know," Morty said softly, "maybe the lantern doesn't belong to us at all. Maybe we're just holding it for a while." Rick sipped his coffee, squinting at the pale light of morning. "And then what? Pass it on? To who?" Morty shrugged. "Doesn't matter who. Somebody will carry it. That's the thing about light. It doesn't ask who notices, it just shines." Rick didn't reply right away. He just stood there, sipping slowly, his gaze caught on the sky, as if he saw something Morty couldn't. Finally he muttered, "You're not as dumb as you look, kid." Morty laughed softly. "Yeah, I know." They stayed there a while, side by side, as the sun rose higher. The warmth touched their faces, quiet and steady, and Morty thought, this was enough. This was the legacy, not a grand story, not a portal to somewhere unreachable, just two people carrying the same light and letting it spill gently into the world. When Morty closed his eyes that night, he dreamed not of lanterns or puddles or watches, but of a single phrase echoing gently through the dark. "The light is yours, and it will always find another." He let the words settle into him like a lullaby, and he drifted into sleep with a soft, steady peace. The lantern had become more than just an image in Morty's dreams. It was something he felt in the quietest corners of his days. in the way Rick sighed after a long night of tinkering, and Morty heard not frustration, but relief. In the way a bird perched on the fence would tilt its head as though sharing the secret of stillness with him. In the way silence itself seemed to glow like a blanket drawn gently over the restless mind. Morty began to notice how things faded, and yet didn't vanish. The puddles dried, but the reflections of the clouds stayed alive in his memory. The lanterns of his dream dimmed, but the warmth of their glow lingered like breath on a cold window. Even Rick's mutterings, sharp, careless, impatient, faded into echoes that somehow carried comfort. Each moment seemed to say goodbye as it passed, but in a way that felt tender, not final. One night, Morty asked quietly, "Rick, do you think things ever really end? Or do they just change shape?" Rick was half asleep in his chair, a glass in his hand. The lab lights dimmed. He cracked one eye open, staring at Morty like the question had tugged him out of somewhere deeper. "Endings are just neat words we slap on messes, Morty. Nothing really ends. It just gets harder to recognize." Morty nodded slowly. "So maybe, even when we go, the light doesn't." Rick didn't answer right away. He just closed his eyes again, mumbling something too soft to catch. But Morty thought he saw the faintest smile trace Rick's lips before sleep pulled him under. That night, Morty dreamed of walking through a field where the lanterns from before had been scattered across the grass. Some flickered faintly, some shone strong, some were no more than gentle embers. Morty picked one up, holding it close. Its warmth spread through his hands, up his arms, into his chest. And when he looked back, Rick was there too, not holding a lantern of his own, but walking in the glow of Morty's. The dream felt like a whisper. It was never about who carried the flame. It was about the light itself. When Morty awoke, he stayed in bed for a long while, staring at the ceiling. The thought of endings no longer frightened him. If things only changed shape, then loss was just another form of becoming. And maybe goodbyes were softer than he'd once believed. The following evening, Morty sat on the porch with Rick. The air was cool, filled with the faint sound of crickets. Rick smoked quietly, the ember of the cigarette glowing like a tiny star. Morty watched it and thought, even this light is part of the lantern. "You ever think," Morty asked gently, "that maybe we don't need to figure it all out? Maybe the point isn't answers, but just holding on long enough to share the light?" Rick took a drag, exhaled, and let the smoke drift upward. "You're starting to sound like a fortune cookie, Morty." "Maybe," Morty said, smiling. "But I think I mean it." Rick didn't argue. He didn't agree either. But his silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, full, the kind of silence that carried more than words could manage. And in that silence, Morty felt the lantern glowing again, not between them, this time, but inside them both. As the night deepened, Morty leaned back, watching the stars. He imagined each one as a lantern, each flicker a reminder that nothing ever truly left, that every act of kindness, every quiet word, every shared laugh was still out there, floating, glowing, waiting for someone to notice. And as sleep crept toward him, Morty whispered a small goodbye, not to Rick, not to the world, but to the boy he once was, the one who thought endings were sharp and cruel, the one who feared being left behind. That boy had walked far enough. He could rest now. Morty let him go with love, and the night carried him gently into dreams. The nights had grown softer somehow, as though the world itself had lowered its voice. Morty noticed it most when he was alone in his room, lying still with the curtains half open, letting the faint silver of moonlight spill across the floor. There was a quiet hum in the silence, like the world breathing with him. And in that breath, he began to hear echoes. Not voices exactly, but something gentler, like memories replaying themselves in the hush of the dark. He would hear the clink of Rick's tools, though the garage was silent. He would hear his mother's laughter from years ago, floating through the thin walls of memory. Sometimes he even swore he could hear his own younger self, giggling nervously, unsure of the world, but full of wonder anyway. The echoes didn't frighten him. They felt like companions, reminders that nothing was ever gone. It was simply folded into the air, waiting for him to listen. One evening, Morty sat outside, the sky faintly bruised with twilight. Rick joined him without a word, settling into the chair with a groan. For a long time they sat together, listening. The cicadas droned, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. The wind brushed the trees like a hand stroking hair. "Do you hear it?" Morty asked suddenly. Rick gave him a look. "Hear what, Morty?" "I hear bugs making a racket and my joints complaining. That what you mean?" Morty shook his head. I mean, the way it feels like everything's talking, even when it's quiet, like the world has its own echo." Rick was silent for a while, then sipped from his flask. "You're not wrong, but most people don't pay enough attention to notice." "Do you?" Morty asked. Rick let out a dry chuckle. "Sometimes, usually when I'm too tired to fight it." They didn't speak after that, but the silence was warm, full. Morty closed his eyes and listened again. He thought of how echoes weren't really voices at all, just sound finding its way back, lingering a little longer than expected. Maybe memories worked the same way. Maybe love did too. That night, Morty dreamed he was walking through a vast hall of mirrors. But instead of his reflection, each mirror showed a different moment from his life. Some were simple, pouring a glass of water, tripping over his shoelaces. Others were luminous. Rick handing him a strange tool, with the faintest smirk of pride. Summer leaning on him after a long day. A stranger once thanking him for holding a door open. As Morty walked, the moments shimmered like lanterns, reflecting not just what had been, but what still was. He realized they weren't gone at all. They were alive inside him, repeating softly, endlessly, like echoes that refused to fade. When he woke, there were tears at the corner of his eyes. Not sad ones, the kind that come when something heavy and beautiful finally rests on the heart. At breakfast, Morty sat quietly, stirring his cereal. Rick raised an eyebrow at his silence. "You okay there, kid? You look like you just saw a ghost." Morty smiled faintly. "Not a ghost, just an echo." Rick squinted, waiting for more. Morty shrugged, not feeling the need to explain. Some things didn't need to be explained to be understood. The day went on, slow and ordinary. But the echoes followed Morty everywhere, in the sound of the fridge door creaking, in the familiar click of Rick's lighter, in the rhythm of his own footsteps. It was as if the whole world had become a gentle chorus, singing back all the small moments he thought were gone. And that night, as he drifted into sleep, Morty realized the echoes weren't just reminders. They were proof that nothing was ever lost, that every word, every kindness, every flicker of love lingered in the air long after the moment had passed. And with that thought, he surrendered to dreams, the echoes lulling him like a lullaby. The days began to feel stretched thin, like the last golden light of evening that lingers before night finally takes the sky. Morty could sense it in the air, in the way Rick moved a little slower, in the way silence carried more weight, in the way moments felt as though they were pausing to leave an imprint before fading. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. More like a soft awareness that change was near. One afternoon, Morty found Rick in the garage, not working on anything in particular. The tools were scattered, the machines quiet. Rick just sat in his chair, staring at the dim hum of a lamp. His flask was in his hand, but he hadn't lifted it for some time. "Rick?" Morty asked, stepping closer. Rick didn't look up. "You ever notice, Morty, how machines don't miss you when you leave them? You can walk away for years, come back, and they don't care, they just sit there. But people notice." Morty hesitated, then sat beside him. "Yeah, I think that's what makes people different. That noticing, it hurts sometimes, but it's real." Rick exhaled through his nose, the sound low, tired. "Hurts, yeah. Real, yeah. Still feels like a scam half the time." Morty looked at him, his chest heavy with a kind of affection that words couldn't carry. "But it's ours. It's what we have. And it doesn't go away, even when things change." Rick finally turned his head, meeting Morty's gaze. For once, his eyes weren't sharp or distant. They were tired, but soft. "You've gotten wiser than me, kid." Morty shook his head. "No, I just listened. To you, to the world, to the echoes." Rick gave a small, cracked laugh, the kind that sounded like it almost hurt, but carried warmth anyway. "Echoes. You really don't let go of an idea once it grabs you." Morty smiled faintly. "Guess I got that from you." They sat in the stillness, the quiet between them thick with unspoken words. Morty didn't need to say goodbye, not yet, but he could feel it drawing closer, like a tide pulling gently at his feet. He didn't resist. He only breathed and let the moment rest. That night, Morty dreamed again of the lanterns, but this time he wasn't walking alone. Rick was beside him, though his steps were slower, heavier. The field stretched wide, the lanterns scattered like stars fallen onto the earth. Rick reached down and picked up a lantern, the glow reflecting in his weathered face. For a moment, Morty thought he would carry it, but instead, Rick placed it in Morty's hands. "You keep this one," he said quietly. "I don't need it anymore." Morty wanted to protest, to tell him he was wrong, that he still needed light too. But when he looked into Rick's eyes, he saw not absence, but peace. Rick wasn't letting go of life, only passing along something that had always been meant to be shared. When Morty woke, he carried the warmth of the dream with him. He didn't tell Rick about it. Some dreams weren't meant to be explained, but the feeling lingered, like a glow beneath the skin. The following evening, they sat again on the porch. The stars were clear, sharp against the velvet dark. Rick lit another cigarette, the ember pulsing faintly in the night air. Morty watched, and for the first time, he didn't fear the silence between them. He welcomed it. "Rick," Morty said softly, "if you ever, go somewhere, I'll still hear you. Like an echo, like a lantern, it won't end. Not for me." Rick's hand trembled slightly as he held the cigarette. He didn't look at Morty, just stared out at the stars. "Yeah, Morty, I know that's the thing about echoes. They stick around even when you don't want them to." Morty leaned back, closing his eyes. "I'll want them, every one of them." The crickets sang, the stars shimmered, and the night folded around them like a blanket. It was not a goodbye, not yet. But it was the shape of one. A soft farewell that didn't need to be spoken to be felt. And as Morty drifted into half-sleep beside his grandfather, he thought, even if the portal gun never lights again, the lantern will. The house seemed unusually quiet, as though even the walls had grown weary of sound. Morty wandered from room to room, touching the edges of things he had always overlooked, the chipped paint on a doorframe, the faint grooves in the wood, where countless feet had passed. Each detail felt suddenly alive, whispering to him that moments mattered, even the smallest ones. Rick was in the kitchen, not drinking, not tinkering, just sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. His back was curved, his eyes half-shadowed. It was strange to see him so still, as though the very motion had drained out of him. Morty sat across from him without a word. For a long while, the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It ticked gently, not hurrying them, not warning them, just marking time as it always had. Finally, Rick spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Morty, you ever realize how many nights we've wasted talking about nothing? How many mornings we've woken up pretending the world hadn't changed?" Morty swallowed. "Maybe we didn't waste them, Rick. Maybe those nights are what kept us going, even if they were small. Even if they were nothing, they still belong to us." Rick rubbed his forehead with his hand, a long sigh escaping him. "You're too good at finding meaning in things. I never was." Morty leaned forward, his voice soft, nearly a whisper. "You didn't need to be, Rick. You just needed to be here." That silenced them both, because they both knew it was true. For all his brilliance, all his chaos, all his wandering through galaxies, Rick's presence in these simple moments was the most important thing he had ever given. Later that evening, they went outside. The air was cool, touched with the faint sweetness of spring. Rick brought a blanket, spreading it across the old porch steps. Morty sat down beside him, pulling the blanket around his shoulders. Above them, the stars shimmered, endless and indifferent, but also strangely tender. Morty had once thought the stars were cold. Now, sitting here with Rick, they seemed warmer than ever, as though each one was an ember carried from the lanterns of memory. Rick pointed at a cluster of stars. "That one there, Morty, people used to think it was a hunter chasing an animal. Whole myths were built around it, wars even, all because of lights in the sky." Morty followed his gaze. "Do you think we'll be a story too, you and me?" Rick chuckled softly, though it was edged with something fragile. "Maybe, but not the kind people write down, more like the kind whispered at night when folks can't sleep, the kind that gets half forgotten but never really fades." Morty smiled faintly. "That's enough." They sat until the stars deepened, until the air grew colder. Morty felt his eyelids grow heavy, but he fought sleep just a little longer, wanting to stretch the moment. "Rick," he murmured, "thank you. For everything, even the hard stuff, even the stuff that hurt." Rick didn't answer right away. He took a long breath, the kind that seemed to carry years with it. "I wasn't always the best, Morty, but I tried. In my own broken way, I tried." Morty turned, his head resting it against Rick's shoulder. "I know, and I heard it, even when you didn't say it." For once, Rick didn't move away. He let Morty lean against him, his arm twitching as though it wanted to wrap around the boy, but couldn't quite manage it. Instead, he just sat there, still and quiet, his presence enough. And in that silence, something gentle settled over them. It wasn't closure, not really. It was more like a sigh, the kind you let out when you've carried something heavy for too long and finally decide to set it down. The night lingered, deep and dreamlike. Morty's breathing slowed, his body leaning heavier against Rick. The stars shimmered overhead, their light patient and eternal. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both knew. This was one of the last nights they would share like this. Not an ending, but a soft unfolding. A lantern passed on, an echo carried forward. And as Morty drifted into sleep, he thought, goodbyes don't need words. Sometimes they're just the sound of breathing side by side. Morning came slowly, like a curtain being drawn back with care. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it has been waiting for a long time. Morty stirred awake, his mind fogged with dreams, and for a moment he thought Rick was still there beside him, still leaning against the porch railing, still breathing the same night air. But when Morty turned, the space was empty. The blanket was folded neatly on the step. The coffee cup sat on the table inside. Tools were in their places in the garage, as though they had been tidied by hands that no longer needed them. And the portal gun, the machine that had once been a window to infinite chaos and wonder, was gone, not broken, not lost, simply absent, as if it had quietly followed its maker into the stars. Morty stood in the stillness, heart steady, not panicked, not even sad in the way he expected. Instead, he felt something like the hush after a song has ended, but its echo still lingers in the ear. Rick had left, yes, but the echo remained. He walked outside, the air cool against his skin. The world looked the same, trees swaying, birds singing, the morning light stretching across the grass. But Morty felt different. It was as though he was carrying two versions of himself, the boy who had once stumbled after Rick into strange adventures, and the young man who now carried a lantern of his own. He closed his eyes and remembered. Not the grand, impossible journeys, not the explosions or the laughter or the wild escapes, but the small things, the half-spoken advice, the quiet nights when they said nothing at all, the look in Rick's eyes when he thought no one was watching. It struck Morty then that legacy wasn't about inventions or galaxies or even stories told by others. Legacy was the warmth you left behind in someone else's chest, the kind of warmth that stayed, glowing softly, long after the lantern had been passed. Morty carried that warmth now. He walked to the old fence, leaning against it the way Rick sometimes did. The wind brushed through his hair, gentle and unhurried. He thought about the last words Rick had spoken, not in the dream, but in life, half grumbled, half avoided, but real. I tried. And Morty smiled, because trying was enough. Somewhere out there, he thought, Rick was still wandering. Maybe not in this form, maybe not with machines or science or flesh, but in echoes, in whispers, in the glow of memory. Perhaps he was a lantern now, scattered across the night sky, burning in countless little lights. Morty didn't need to find him. He didn't need to chase him through portals or galaxies. He only needed to close his eyes, breathe deeply, and feel the presence that lived within him, quiet and steady, like a heartbeat. The day stretched on, slow and tender. Morty walked through it without hurry, touching the edges of things the way he had the night before. Every detail felt alive, every shadow seemed gentle. He carried no fear of being alone, for he was not alone, not really. And when night came again, Morty lit a lantern. Just a simple one, small and glass-bound, glowing softly on the porch. He sat beside it, watching the flame dance. He thought, this is what Rick gave me. Not a weapon, not a machine, but this. A light that can be carried, a warmth that can be shared. He leaned back, eyes heavy, and whispered softly into the quiet. Good night, Rick. Wherever you are. The flame flickered, as if answering. And with that, Morty closed his eyes. He didn't dream of portals, not this time. He dreamed of a quiet porch, a folded blanket, a sky full of lanterns. A story that had ended, and yet would never truly end. And so the tale of the portal gun, of Rick's endless wandering and Morty's quiet growth, drifted into the soft folds of memory. Not a conclusion, but a continuation, an echo, a lantern, a lullaby carried into the stars. and somewhere he's still out there, napping in the sun.